It all starts on a cold Christmas Eve over there. A father asks his daughter if she had fun today, and she excitedly replies that it was the best day ever. Suddenly, the family bumps right into a very tall man. The little girl looks up and comments that the guy is absolutely massive. The prota then has to step aside to avoid them while complaining about always being the one who has to give way to others. Shortly after, he realizes that it actually makes sense, because in the middle of that huge crowd on the street, he is the only one who is completely alone. He then makes his way toward the subway entrance. However, something catches his attention. There was a man dressed as Santa Claus begging for help on the ground. This Santa is completely curled up on the cold floor, trying to shield himself from the snow. Next to him is a sign asking people to share a wish, and the prota thinks that normally he would just walk past, but he feels something different this time. He remembers that today is Christmas Eve and decides to kneel down beside the elderly man. That date reminds him of the day he was left all alone after losing his parents in an accident. He reaches out, offering a paper bill and a wrapped sandwich, telling the old man to take it because it is still good. The young man gently places the money and the food on top of the cardboard. But suddenly, the elderly man grabs the young man's hand with immense strength and speaks emotionally about what a kind soul he is. Santa keeps holding his hands firmly and says he wants to repay his kindness by asking him to reveal his true wish. The young man gets startled, wondering if the guy has lost his mind, and calmly asks him to just let go already. The prota tries to pull his arm back, but he realizes in utter shock that the old man's grip is impossibly strong. Santa says he came all the way there to grant a wish for a good person, while the young man realizes with a shock that he cannot move at all. The old man begs, saying he cannot return to Santa's village without granting a wish, making the young man let out a defeated sigh. The young man asks if he will let him go if he makes a request, and the old man cheerfully promises he will. Looking into the old man's eyes, the young man begins to speak his wish. He asks to win the lottery, but Santa senses that it is not a sincere wish and begs for the true desire of his heart. The young man stays silent for a moment and begins to reflect on what his true desire really is. He remembers the pain of loss and how he always wanted to have a family that would stay by his side and never abandon him. So the young man reveals that his wish is to have a lovely wife and an extremely cute little daughter. Man, that is every guy's ultimate dream right there. This prota really knows what is up. Santa begins to cry with emotion upon feeling the sincerity of the request and says he can tell how much he has lived isolated for a long time. The old man smiles warmly and remarks that he was very lucky to find someone with a soul so similar to his own. Suddenly, Santa's gaze turns terrifying as he promises to find him a pure wife and a daughter who will love her father. The old man wishes with all his heart for the young man to have a very happy life, while the young man begins to feel strange and lightheaded. The young man finally manages to break free and runs away in a panic, thinking that Santa is totally out of his mind. The old man shouts from afar that he will use all his power and that the entire village is rooting for him, leaving the young man even more terrified. Once safe, the young man looks at his own wrist and notices that the mark from the old man's grip has turned bright red and bruised. Sitting inside the subway car, he keeps thinking about the wild things that man said and concludes that he was just a crazy homeless guy. Even though he considers the whole thing total madness, he admits to himself that he chose to make the wish for a deeply personal reason. He looks at a poster of a happy family and acknowledges that deep down, he also wishes to find true happiness. I totally feel you, prota. We are in the exact same boat. The young man closes his tired eyes and intensely wishes to have a normal life just like all other regular people do. Suddenly, he starts to smell a very strong and strange scent spreading all around him while everything fades to black. Suddenly feeling an extreme cold, the young man wakes up dizzy and confused, not understanding what is happening to his body. Upon opening his eyes, he gets a huge shock. The young man realizes he is trapped inside a cage. He sees himself chained up, barely wearing any clothes, and locked behind bars, desperately asking himself where on earth he ended up. Looking around and seeing other people trapped as well, he wonders if he somehow got transported back to the Middle Ages. You asked for a cute wife and got a slave's life instead. Guess I am doing way better than you right now, prota. At that moment, he hears approaching footsteps and catches someone speaking in a completely incomprehensible language. Seeing guards dressed in medieval armor pass nearby, the young man realizes he cannot understand a single thing they are saying. He notices the absence of Asian people and the strange dialect, feeling as though he was thrown directly onto the set of a period film. Not knowing whether he is living through a nightmare or if all of this is real, he tries to stay calm to assess the situation. He finally arrives at the terrifying conclusion that he really ended up being transported to a completely unknown another world. Shivering uncontrollably from the cold and sheer anxiety, the young man lets out a deep sigh while feeling the uncomfortable weight of the chains on his feet. He looks at one of the prisoners slumped in the corner of the cage and wonders if the man ended up passing away, concluding that the living must keep fighting to survive. He sighs and mentally apologizes to the man while taking the clothes off his body so he can cover up and protect himself from that intense cold. Next, the young man puts on the green tunic he just managed to get and feels immediate relief against the low temperature. He lies down on the rough wooden floor of the cart while the voice of that crazy Santa promising to grant his wish echoes in his mind. The young man wonders if that terrible situation was the happiness the old man was talking about, questioning if he himself had the wrong concept of happiness all along. With his heart full of anguish, he mentally begs to just wake up already, hoping the whole thing is nothing more than a terrible nightmare. Not knowing how many days have passed while they travel toward an entirely unknown destination, he remains trapped inside that endless cage. Despite the exhaustion, the young man starts piecing the clues together and realizes that every single person in there, including himself, is a slave. He lets out a long sigh and begins to understand the real reason why they are being dragged along by those armed soldiers. The prota looks at the other prisoners and realizes they are being taken to a slave market where they will be sold off to the highest bidder. Suddenly, the door to the iron cage gets unlocked. Whenever the soldiers organize a lineup of slaves, a man who appears to be the local village leader begins selecting the healthiest and strongest individuals. Even though it hurts his pride immensely to accept that he is now just a slave, a small part of him begins to feel a tiny flicker of hope. He sees this selection process as his only chance to escape that miserable cart, believing he would be bought quickly since he is in great physical shape. However, all that initial excitement he felt right after ending up in that world ends up being very short-lived. That little bit of hope turns into complete despair after they pass through several other villages without anyone showing any interest in him. As the cart continues its journey, the young man gloomily wonders how his life could have reached such a pathetic low point. He lies down feeling completely drained, questioning whether it is even worth it to keep living in such a humiliating way. In that sad moment, he recalls a piece of advice from his mother, who used to ask little Ju-wan to always give his absolute best in everything. She would look at him lovingly and ask if the boy understood how important it was to never give up on things. Back to reality, Ju-hwan mentally calls out to his late parents, wondering if he will truly have the strength to endure all this suffering. The image of that crazy Santa promising to use his magical powers to grant his wish comes back to haunt his mind. Completely infuriated by the situation, he reaches out his trembling hand toward a metal fork. He grips the utensil with immense force, cursing both the new world he is in and the old life he used to have to Ju-wan. The only possible escape from that painful moment would be to end his own story and finally break free from so much suffering. He presses the tines of the fork against his own neck, but stops the action at the very last second. Upon realizing that it is not the right way out, he remembers his grand dream of having a family and realizes he does not want to pass away right there, when suddenly someone speaks near the cage in a strange language. The young man gets startled by the sudden voice, lowers the metal fork, and looks toward the bars of the cage. He is surprised to see a hand reaching through the iron bars, extending a piece of bread directly to him. It turns out to be a beautiful young woman with long hair, smiling warmly at him as she offers the food. She hands the bread to Ju-hwan while speaking a few words in her language that he still cannot understand. Suddenly, an adorable little blonde girl pops out from behind the lady's dress. Peeking at the young man with curiosity, Ju-hwan gets so mesmerized by the sweetness of the two that he ends up dropping the metal fork from his hand onto the floor of the cage. Wow, they are so freaking cute. The scene then shifts to the exterior of a simple wooden cabin. Inside the cabin, the young woman and the little girl are sitting around a wooden table, having a meal. Noticing how hungry the child is, the young woman pushes her own plate over, telling her to eat more. The little girl points at the young woman and says that if she is hungry, the lady named Lizzie must be starving too. The little one decides to share the food and pushes one of the bowls right back toward Lizzie. Lizzie smiles, deeply moved by the child's sweet gesture, and agrees that the two of them should eat together. But suddenly, heavy knocks interrupt their moment at the door, accompanied by the village chief's voice calling out to them. The village chief says there is no need to open the door and asks her to just listen, causing Lizzie to pull the little girl into a protective hug. He informs her that they have decided to pick one of the slaves brought in by the soldiers to be her new husband, ordering her to get ready to head back up the mountain with him tomorrow. He also tells her to go to the village entrance at dawn, bringing food for the soldiers. Before calmly stepping away from the window, Lizzie enters a total panic, not knowing what to do or how to react, having never imagined they would make such a major decision so quickly. She feels a profound fear of enduring physical harm once again in the future, crying desperately as she relives past traumas. Poor girl, I really hope this slave turns out to be our prota. Lizzie trembles out of sheer horror, but sadly realizes she cannot just run away and abandon everything out of nowhere. Even though the two have not been together for very long, deep down she knows she would never have the heart to leave the little girl behind. The young woman cries uncontrollably at the thought of leaving that child completely alone in the world once more, flat out refusing to do it. Tears start trickling down the little girl's face. Seeing that Lizzie was crying, the little girl breaks down and starts crying right alongside her. After that, the two begin comforting one another while holding each other tight. After that, Lizzie grows deep in thought about what is going to happen to her from now on. She grows terrified of having to go through that entire terrible nightmare all over again. Lizzie then looks at the little girl one more time, thinking about how the child has also suffered way too much in the past. The girl, who was only 5 years old and the daughter of her late husband who ended up passing away, is so neglected that she has not even been given a proper name yet. Lizzie recalls her own painful past, back when her own father sold her off to someone else for the price of a single rabbit pelt. On the very first day she arrived at that humble cabin, even before she could put her things away, she was beaten by her late husband. That cowardly assault happened simply because Lizzie arrived at the cabin a little bit later than the man expected. That was his sole excuse to hit her, forcing her to realize in a cruel way that her life of misery was only just beginning in another memory. Lizzie appears passed out on the cold wooden floor of the cabin after enduring severe physical attacks. Suddenly, the little girl approaches with slow, timid steps toward where the injured lady is lying. Lizzie opens her eyes with immense difficulty and pain, coming face to face with the quiet presence of the child in the middle of that absolute living nightmare that was her life. The little girl was looking at her with eyes filled with concern. The little one decides to sit down right next to Lizzie's slumped body, simply wanting to keep the lady company. Lizzie realizes that that sweet, angelic child was the only one who ever reached out a hand to give her any sort of affection and support. One day, the abusive husband went up the mountain and never came back, leaving just the two of them isolated in the cabin. The villagers rumored that the man had been devoured by wolves in the forest and that he would never return home again. Upon receiving the news of her abuser's passing, the young woman confesses that she felt an overwhelming sense of initial relief in her heart. However, along with that fleeting relief, she was also gripped by a deep sense of fear regarding what lay ahead. Lizzie thinks that, in that cruel world, a woman without a husband is like a defenseless sheep left abandoned outside a protective fence. The next morning, she walks hand in hand with the little blonde girl through the village, moving forward with resolve toward her destination. Suddenly, the little girl points ahead in surprise and catches Lizzie's attention after noticing some commotion up ahead. She excitedly mentions that it is a large cart. While pointing her finger straight toward the iron cage, Lizzie slowly approaches the cart to see who is inside and comes across the solitary prisoner. She is completely shocked when she looks closely and sees the young slave kneeling inside the cage, about to harm his own neck. Lizzie's eyes widen in sheer horror and despair, feeling her heart race at that terrible sight. That moment makes her remember her abusive ex-husband, who constantly hit her while calling her useless and saying she never did anything right. She looks at the young man with the fork aimed at his neck and recognizes in his eyes the exact same deep pain and despair she knows all too well. She remembers with terror how her abuser used to grab her roughly, mocking with hatred and aggression how close she was to the little girl. In the memory, the ex-husband throws an object onto the floor in anger, saying she ruined his appetite, while Lizzie cries on her knees, shielding the little girl. Lizzie silently cries as she remembers all that physical and mental anguish she spent her entire life enduring. As she locks her eyes on the slave in the cage, she sees the exact same desperation that used to torment her, deciding to do something to help him somehow. She reaches out with kindness and takes a piece of fresh bread from inside her wicker basket, holding the bread tightly with one hand. Lizzie walks calmly alongside the little blonde girl over to the large cart. With deep compassion, she extends the fresh food directly through the cold iron bars to the young prisoner. Juwon freezes and looks in awe at the beautiful young woman and the little girl, letting his fork drop onto the floor, completely forgotten. At that moment, the village chief suddenly appears and mentions that she has finally arrived, startling the young woman a bit. The old man takes the food basket and says they will take care of the soldiers, telling her to return immediately to the safety of the village. Lizzie meekly agrees and calls the little blonde girl to leave, while the young slave watches the two walk away while holding the bread. The little blonde girl glances back one last time with a thoughtful expression as she is led away by Lizzie. All alone in the cage, Ju-hwan looks at the bread he just received, his emotions completely mixed up. Suddenly, a loud metallic noise echoes as the cage door is harshly unlocked, startling the young man. Two heavily armed guards step inside and shout aggressively for him to get out of the cart immediately. Without any care, the soldiers throw the young man out of the cage, sending him tumbling straight onto the dusty ground. Sprawled on the dirt and groaning in pain, he quickly scans the area with his eyes, looking for the piece of bread Lizzie gave him. The village chief approaches the slaves kneeling next to the guards and announces to everyone that the official selection is about to begin. Without warning, the guards use daggers to slice the hands of the prisoners, making blood splatter as they scream out in pain. The guards collect the blood from the wounded on old pieces of paper and wipe the dagger's blade with absolute coldness. Ju-hwan watches it all in horror, wondering what kind of bizarre magic is making those papers glow with a blue aura. Ju-hwan lets out an exhausted sigh, completely lost and confused by all these weird occurrences, asking himself what kind of bizarre world he ended up in. Meanwhile, one of the guards approaches the village chief and whispers something important in his ear regarding the situation. The old man listens attentively and decides to walk over to Ju-hwan, who remains kneeling anxiously on the ground. The young man looks up in confusion, not understanding why the village leader is staring at him with such intense focus. The scene then cuts back to Lizzie's simple wooden cabin in the middle of the forest. A village woman hands over a large bundle of supplies and tells Lizzie to take it to the cabin, assuring her they will be provided with food for a while. She cautions that the new husband does not know their language and bluntly emphasizes that Lizzie will have to pay back all that help later on. With her arms crossed, the older woman confesses that no one in the village liked Lizzie's ex-husband and that they only tolerated him because they needed a mountain guardian. She explains that the chosen new husband is quite different, mentioning that the soldiers speculated he might just be a regular citizen. The woman adds that, although he might look a bit intimidating at first glance, he has hands as soft as those of a nobleman. She holds Lizzie's hands and tries to reassure her, saying those hands have never hit anyone, and that she will live very well if he knows how to hunt. Lizzie turns her gaze away melancholically and softly replies that she does not care about living a luxurious life or living exceptionally well. With a sad expression, she simply wishes with all her heart that her new companion will not be a violent and aggressive man like the last one. She strokes the hair of the sleeping girl and thinks that if he just leaves the two of them in peace, that will be more than enough. Suddenly, loud knocks on the door interrupt her thoughts, followed by someone demanding that they open up right away. Lizzie gets a major scare and turns quickly toward the door with an expression of pure anxiety. Through the cabin window, she can see the village chief accompanied by a very tall and imposing male silhouette. The village chief swings open the wooden door and bluntly announces that he has brought the man she is going to marry. Nervous, Lizzie stammers as she mentions her own husband. While the old man orders the guards to bring the young guy inside, Ju-hwan slowly enters the simple cabin, asking himself in confusion where on earth they ended up. Now Lizzie wonders anxiously why they are still dragging a wounded man along, questioning if he really is who she thinks he is. She observes the tall guy who just walked in, nervously asking herself if he is the man she is about to marry. The young woman swallows hard and feels completely intimidated, thinking she has never seen anyone so impossibly huge in her entire life. Ju-hwan also looks down at Lizzie and lets out a slight look of surprise as he notices the young woman. He stares closely at her for a second and realizes in absolute shock that she is the exact same charitable person who gave him that piece of bread. I am super happy the prota got himself a family, but now it is just me, all by myself again. However, the young man notices that Lizzie's body is shaking violently out of sheer terror, wondering why she is so scared. The village chief grabs Ju-hwan's arm and asks why he is just standing there, leaving the young man confused by the interruption. The old man pulls Ju-hwan firmly toward Lizzie, ordering him to get closer to her once and for all. Lizzie cringes in fear, and the little blonde girl hides behind her dress in terror, while the old man keeps shoving Ju-hwan forward. The old man grips the young guy's arm tightly to push him closer, telling him not to be so stiff now that he is getting married without wasting any time. The old man takes Ju-hwan's and Lizzie's hands and forces them together in front of everyone in the cabin. The village chief cheerfully remarks that standing there holding hands like that, the two really look like a lovely married couple. He grows very tense in that awkward atmosphere, and even without understanding their language, he starts suspecting what is actually going on. Santa's terrifying, booming promise about getting him a pure wife and an adorable daughter echoes loudly in his mind. He focuses his gaze on Lizzie, mentally comparing her sweetness and shyness to the image of a gentle bride, soft like a rabbit. Next, he looks at the little blonde girl and playfully compares her to a cute little mongoose. Ju-won starts to question if that Santa was actually real, and if he truly ended up granting his genuine wish to have a family. Dude, please tell me where I can find a Santa like that for myself. Even so, the young man thinks indignantly that the old guy did not need to go way over the top to the point of sending him to a completely different world. He remembers all the anguish of being a caged slave and wonders if he could not have received this gift without going through so much suffering. Man, if you do not want it, I sure do. Let us swap places right now. The young guy takes a deep breath and lowers his head for a moment to try and calm down and process this unbelievable turn of events in his life. Ju-won gets super annoyed and angrily thinks that if he ever runs into that Santa again, he is going to mess him up real good. His furious vibe is so terrifying that Lizzie and the little girl shrink back in absolute terror, trembling at his massive size. Later on, outside the cabin, the village chief begins speaking to Ju-won in front of other local residents. The old man gesticulates and shouts impatiently, driving the young man crazy, since he cannot understand a single word being said. Not knowing how to communicate, the old man glances toward one of the locals who is closely watching the conversation. That man then extends his hand toward Ju-won, who gets pretty confused, wondering if it is supposed to be a handshake. The young man decides to accept the greeting, but suddenly feels the villager's grip turn unimaginably tight and crushing. While the man strains and sweats in pain trying to squeeze with all his strength, Ju-won remains calm, wondering if that painful grip is just the local standard handshake. The young man narrows his eyes and lets out a thoughtful murmur, realizing that his physical strength is now far superior to that of a normal human being. He decides to lightly squeeze back, causing the villager to drop to his knees and scream in pain, leaving Ju-won completely baffled by his reaction. The village chief yells in horror for Ju-won to let the man go, seeing the local shaking in pain from the crushing grip. He decides to hand a bow and arrow to the young man to change the subject and focus on another duty. Ju-won holds the wooden weapon firmly, feeling the weight of the bow for the very first time. He wonders why the old man handed him that weapon, reasoning that it does not seem to be a provocation for a fight. Next, the old man puts both hands on his head, imitating long ears, trying to mime something for the young guy. Ju-won watches that bizarre scene of the old man hopping around and realizes, surprised, that he is imitating a wild rabbit. He finally catches on and understands that the village chief wants him to learn how to hunt animals nearby. Suddenly, the old man starts gesturing in panic upon noticing a silent movement among the trees. He quickly points toward a nearby bush, indicating that there is prey within their reach. It turns out to be a chubby little white rabbit peacefully eating some leaves on the forest floor. The old man desperately yells for him to shoot already, but Ju-won freezes up, having never held a bow before. He kneels down to take aim, but anxiously thinks that for beginners, it is nearly impossible to hit such a small target from that distance. Even while hesitating, Ju-won pulls the string all the way back and releases the arrow, generating a massive burst of wind all around him. The arrow zips past at insane speed, scaring the rabbit away and leaving Ju-won himself shocked at the power of the shot. While the old man celebrates by clapping excitedly, the young guy stays sitting on the ground, unable to comprehend where all that raw power and accuracy came from. Right then, soft footsteps catch their attention, indicating that someone is approaching the hunting spot. Turning around suddenly, the young man spots Lizzie walking over with the basket alongside the other older woman and the little blonde girl. He freezes up watching them come closer, feeling his heart beat in a completely different way as he sees them up close. He locks his eyes on the beautiful young woman walking while holding the basket, realizing that she really is his future wife. The young guy blushes slightly and feels a strong, warm flutter in his chest as he takes in the sweetness and beauty of his bride. Ju-won gets extremely embarrassed and turns bright red in front of everyone, while the old man watches him. Intrigued by that bashful reaction, the three of them decide to sit down together on a white sheet, spread out over the grass to enjoy a peaceful meal outdoors. With great care, Lizzie serves a bowl of soup and hands it to the young man, who shyly thanks her with a slight nod of his head. He holds the bowl and looks at the hot soup packed with vegetables and chunks of meat, which looks incredibly tasty and appetizing. Ju-won begins eating in silence under the attentive and curious gazes of Lizzie and the little blonde girl. Both sides keep shyly looking at each other, feeling the heavy silence hanging in the air between them during the meal. The young man gazes ahead, diving deep into his own thoughts about his new life reality. Juwan smiles softly and thinks that having a family is something completely new and extraordinary for him. From his teenage years all the way to turning 30, his normal routine was always waking up alone in a completely empty and cold room. However, he realizes that now he finally has people by his side that he can actually call family. Although he thought it would have been better if everything had happened naturally, he admits that after so much suffering, the order of things does not even matter anymore. He takes a deep breath and looks up at the blue sky, thinking that while he feels like beating up that Santa, he also feels a totally different emotion inside. The young man softens his heart and sincerely thanks the old man in his mind for granting his deepest, truest wish. The following day, things move really fast, and Juwan is already shown carrying a massive bundle of supplies on his back through the forest. He glances back out of the corner of his eye, worried about whether his new companion and the little girl are able to keep up with him. He notices that the two are winded and look completely exhausted and drained from the long walk through the forest. The young guy gets pretty frustrated at not even being able to ask if they are okay due to the massive language barrier. He seriously concludes that he needs to adapt and learn the language of that world as fast as he possibly can to help them out. Juwan remembers a crucial piece of advice from his late mother about never hesitating when you genuinely want to protect someone. She used to smile and say that if he wanted to protect the people he loves, he should act immediately without any hesitation whatsoever. Juwan walks ahead carrying the heavy load, focused on following the path and securing their livelihood. He turns around again and notices that Lizzie and the little one are having a really hard time keeping up with his pace. The little blonde girl looks up with her eyes brimming with tears and starts crying from sheer exhaustion from the long trek, seeing how tired they are. The young man gently lowers himself to the girl's height and softly lets her know he is going to carry her to help out. Lizzie freezes in total terror at the young guy's sudden approach, fearing that something terrible might happen to the little girl. Desperate, she clasps her hands together, begging in her own language for him not to do anything bad, leaving Juwan completely confused. The girl also starts crying in terror upon seeing the panicked reaction of her protector. He realizes that his serious expression frightens them way too much and upsetly concludes they are only acting like this simply because he is near. Even so, knowing they need help, he mentally asks for permission and decides to extend his arms in a very gentle manner. To Lizzie's complete shock, the young man uses his extraordinary strength to lift her off the ground, right alongside the little blonde girl at the exact same time. Lizzie lets out a gasp of amazement upon realizing she was lifted with effortless ease while the little girl holds on tight to him. The young man settles them comfortably in each of his arms, displaying physical strength that is truly beyond normal. He stands tall, holding both of them at once without showing the slightest bit of strain, leaving Lizzie completely lost for words. The little blonde girl widens her bright eyes in pure admiration and begins babbling a few words in her language. Juwan focuses on the path ahead and decides to pick up the pace through the forest so they can reach their destination quickly. He gently tells her to hold on tight, making Lizzie look at him with a warm glow of gratitude and emotion in her eyes. As he walks quickly, Juwan thinks that despite carrying the heavy gear and both of them, they feel shockingly light and far too skinny. He mentally decides that he must learn to hunt and speak their language as soon as possible to make sure they eat plenty of meat and stay healthy. Feeling the gentle touch of the young woman on his shoulder, he reflects that he is going to have a very busy life packed with duties from here on out. Juwan feels a drop of sweat trickle down his neck, but presses onward. Determined to protect and take care of his precious new family, Lizzie timidly reaches out her hand and touches Juwan's broad shoulder to try and catch his attention. Her soft hand rests on the young man's shoulder, causing him to stop walking right in his tracks. She turns her face away, blushing from shyness, feeling quite embarrassed to be carried around like that. Even so, Juwan continues his steady walk along the forest trail, carrying the two of them with total ease in his arms. Upon arriving in front of the old cabin, the young man bows and sincerely thanks the village chief for showing them the way. The old man simply waves his hand and begins walking away with slow steps, leaving them all alone at the site. Juwan inspects the humble cabin and anxiously thinks that living there must be way colder than his old penthouse room. He curls up, shivering from the cold, and angrily thinks that after everything he went through, he has come to hate low temperatures even more. With determination, the young man reaches out his hand to push open the old wooden door of the cabin and step inside the residence. But as he swings the door open once and for all, his eyes widen in total shock at what he finds inside. Upon stepping into the cabin, Lizzie becomes deeply shaken and begins crying in utter desperation at the sight before her. Juwan watches her, completely unable to understand the reason behind so much sadness, and anxiously wonders why she is crying like that. Without saying a word, the young woman rushes past him and hurries out of the cabin, leaving the young man utterly baffled. He turns around to look at the interior of the home and realizes that the entire place was completely ransacked and left empty. Ju-won stands frozen at the doorway of the empty cabin, trying to make sense of that whole miserable situation. Outside, Lizzie cries as she realizes the villagers stole everything that was inside the cabin, from the furniture all the way to the tools and hunting weapons. She panics, thinking about how much colder it is going to get and the complete lack of defense if any wild animal shows up to attack them. Ju-won slowly walks through the forest and finally finds her sitting on the grass, crying all by herself, with great patience and gentleness. The young man decides to sit down right beside her on the grass to keep her company. To Lizzie's huge surprise, Ju-won reaches out his hand and gives her head an extremely soft pat to try and calm her down. Ju-won keeps stroking Lizzie's hair with extreme gentleness, trying to comfort her amidst her tears. He softly tells her not to worry, and the young woman stares at him with teary eyes, trying to understand his words. She silently reflects that this gentle young man in front of her is the person she will have to spend the rest of her days with. She thinks anxiously that they cannot communicate and that he is just a mountain guardian who does not even know how to hunt. The young woman questions herself with immense doubt and fear, wondering if they will truly be able to survive together in such an isolated and harsh place. With a warm and confident smile on his face, the young man firmly promises that he will protect her from any danger from now on. He affectionately places his hand on her face, making Lizzie feel deeply comforted despite all her doubts and fears. In that beautiful sunset setting, the young man patiently wipes away her tears, projecting a massive sense of security. Lizzie wonders in surprise why she feels so relieved and at peace beside a man she literally just met. Meanwhile, Ju-won sorrowfully recalls his life back on Earth, where he always lived in total loneliness ever since his parents passed away. He remembers how he struggled and survived in the past, touching her with deep empathy and affection. Ju-won reflects that now that he has a real family to protect, there is absolutely no reason for him to give up on fighting determined. He beats his own chest, assuring her that he will do whatever it takes to support them and take care of everything. Lizzie can no longer hold back her emotions in the face of such immense kindness and begins sobbing out of relief and built-up pain. She collapses and rests her head against Ju-won's broad chest, weeping heavily to let out all the hurt she had kept bottled up. Suddenly, the little blonde girl comes running from afar in desperation, screaming Lizzie's name as she sees the scene. She hugs the young woman protectively and cries loudly, begging in panic for the young man not to hurt Lizzie. Ju-won sits frozen on his knees on the grass, while the two of them cry desperately right in front of him. He watches with immense tenderness as his young wife sobs with emotion right in his arms. Seeing the little blonde girl crying right next to her, the young man concludes that this whole intense family dynamic is completely brand new to him. Ju-won starts remembering when he first met Lizzie back in the cart, wondering whose child that was and why that woman had handed him a piece of bread. He also recalls seeing her cry and wondering what caused that sadness, realizing that things were about to change. Ju-won thinks that if he puts in real effort while they live together, they will definitely become a true family. He affectionately embraces both of them and promises that he will make them deeply happy, assuring that he will never let either of them cry again. Man, this family is so darn cute. I am literally gonna tear up watching this. The young man decides he will be a good husband and a great father, promising to make sure they never regret having him as part of their family. Look, if the Prota ever does them wrong, I am personally gonna go over there and beat him up myself. Time passes, and the sun begins to set over the cozy wooden cabin nestled in the middle of the forest. Now inside the house, an awkward silence fills the room as Lizzie and the little girl sit on one side while Ju-won sits on the other. Ju-won feels self-conscious and thinks that despite getting closer when she cried on his shoulder, it feels like they went right back to square one. Even so, he feels relieved to notice that Lizzie seems merely shy rather than terrified, though he stays thoughtful about what he should do first. Suddenly, an idea pops into Ju-won's mind, and he lets out an exclamation as he realizes exactly what he needs to do to break the ice. Ju-won crawls forward across the wooden floor, startling the young mother and the little blonde girl a bit. With a friendly smile, the young man points to himself and says out loud that his name is Kim Ju-hwan. He repeats his name slowly and explains that since they are going to live together, they should at least know each other's names. Lizzie gets quite surprised hearing him speak and mutters his name in a very shy and hesitant manner. Ju-hwan gently extends his hand toward her and asks her to tell him her own name as well. She hesitates for a second and ends up whispering almost inaudibly that her name is Lizzie and repeats her own name a little louder, and the young guy finally catches on, exclaiming with genuine joy, He compliments her, saying that Lizzie is a really lovely name, but notices that the two of them keep staring at him in complete silence. Right after, he turns to the little blonde girl and asks with all the calm in the world what her name is. However, the mood turns very tense and quiet all over again, leaving Juhwan confused. Unable to grasp the reason for so much hesitation, Juhwan notices that the little blonde girl is shaking her head side to side and deduces that she does not have a name yet. The young guy feels somewhat surprised and touched, seeing the girl's sad little face at his question. With great affection, he rests his hand on her head and decides that he will give a special name to the little one. He kneels down in front of the child and announces that her name from now on will be Dorothy Juwan, wishes for her to be strong like the girl from The Wizard of Oz and to experience great adventures alongside good friends. He sincerely roots from the bottom of his heart for the little girl to find her own happiness along this new path. He knows she has everything it takes to become an extremely lovely girl, full of light in their lives. The child repeats the name slowly, her tiny eyes sparkling, and Juwan confirms that this name will help her find friends and people to love her. She flashes a huge smile and repeats the name in an extremely happy way, feeling super proud of herself. Sometime later, Juhwan is already outside the house working hard, splitting firewood with all his physical strength. Hidden behind a tree, Lizzie watches the young man work from a distance, thinking to herself that he is a very peculiar man. She notices that his body and hands are much larger than those of her late husband, but instead of hurting her, he chooses to be kind. Lizzie realizes he is nothing like anyone she has ever met before, feeling as though Juwan belongs to an entirely different species of human. As she whispers his name, she reflects that even though she does not know the language he speaks, his pronunciation is refined and his voice is very gentle. Looking back at her own past of suffering, she realizes that no one had ever treated her with such immense kindness. Before Lizzie continues watching the smiling young man, wondering why he is being so incredibly good to her, Juwan senses he is being watched and turns around in confusion. While she concludes that he does not seem to belong in that simple place at all, the moment he spots her behind the tree, the young man flashes a friendly smile and waves his hand, happily calling out to Lizzie. She stares back at him in utter surprise and notices his striking features, focusing heavily on his dark hair and his deep black eyes. She remembers old rumors about a successful summoning ritual that supposedly brought a legendary hero from another world to the war. Lizzie thinks it is mind-blowing that the legend about the great warrior with black hair and black eyes might actually be true. She watches the young guy slowly approach with that remarkably calm and friendly expression. Lizzie thinks he somewhat fits the description of the legend, but quickly brushes that crazy idea out of her mind. After all, it makes no sense for a legendary hero to be working as a guardian in a simple, isolated cabin like that one. On top of that, she recalls that those stories about saviors from another world are nothing more than distant rumors from the capital. When Juwan finally steps close and stands right next to her, Lizzie lets out a soft gasp of surprise upon seeing him up close. Up close, Lizzie notices his hair is actually more brown than black, which completely shatters her initial theory. She lets out a relieved sigh, realizing he is just an ordinary guy who happens to be much stronger and taller than most right after. She questions herself as to why she felt so relieved, considering they literally met on that exact same day. Juwan stands there completely baffled, watching the young woman blush and quickly shake her head from side to side. In an extremely gentle manner, Juwan reaches out his arm and softly places his hand on Lizzie's head. She feels his gentle touch and thinks to herself that she still cannot get used to so much affection. Lizzie sorrowfully recalls that in her past, a man's hand on her head was used only to harm her. But contrary to all the fear she used to feel, Juwan simply gives her hair a very tender and comforting stroke. Lizzie finds that feeling wonderful and deep down wishes he would keep comforting her in that gentle way. She completely surrenders to the moment and lifts her face very slowly, desperately wanting that affection to never end. The young guy also gets extremely flushed. Seeing her look at him with such sweetness and vulnerability, Lizzie partially closes her eyes, letting all the affection she is feeling at that moment show on her blushed face. Unexpectedly, Juwan leans in and gives her a sweet, affectionate kiss. Her eyes widen in shock, feeling her face burn with embarrassment from that kiss. Finally, a real prota making a move. That's my boy. Juwan was also feeling embarrassed, but that was a truly special moment for him. Lizzie stays completely frozen and in total shock from the sudden kiss, looking like a block of ice from pure embarrassment. The young guy starts sweating nervously, stammering heavily, unable to put together a single coherent sentence to apologize. In pure desperation over that awkward situation, he quickly grabs his wooden bucket and decides to run away from there as fast as possible. He runs off as fast as his legs can carry him, leaving Lizzie behind, still extremely confused and bright red. She places her hand on her chest, trying to calm her racing heart, unable to believe what just happened between the two of them. As he walks through the forest with the bucket in hand, Ju-won calls himself an idiot and worries deeply about what she must be thinking of him. He deeply regrets his hasty action, remembering that despite the arranged marriage, they had met that exact same day. The young guy wonders what he should do now since they do not even understand each other, considering just pretending nothing happened when he goes back. Suddenly, his footsteps on the grass come to an abrupt halt in the middle of the path when he senses something strange right up ahead. Ju-hwan looks around and notices that the forest has gotten very dark, realizing he walked way too far and ended up getting lost. Quite eerie noises begin echoing through the dry tree branches of that unknown part of the woods. He thinks the best thing to do is simply fill the bucket with water and head back home, but comes to a sudden stop mid-step. Suddenly, the young man feels a bone-chilling shiver run up his spine and widens his eyes as he senses a threat looming very close by. A monstrous silhouette of a giant wolf with glowing red eyes emerges from the shadows right in front of him. The terrifying creature lets out a chilling growl that echoes through the forest. Putting Ju-won on high alert, Ju-won freezes as he comes face to face with a wolf of that massive size right in the middle of the path. Man, that looks just like me. Whenever things are finally going right, something pops up to mess it all up. In a swift, quiet movement, he crouches down to try and find anything on the ground that could serve as protection. With great firmness, the young guy grabs a thick wooden branch that was lying on the grass so he can defend himself. He stands up holding the makeshift club while the giant wolf roars fiercely, preparing to pounce on him with everything it has got. The giant wolf lunges wildly and bites down with immense force on the branch Ju-won is using to shield himself. Ju-won lets out a battle cry and delivers a powerful punch with his free fist to push the beast away. The blow hits the creature right on the snout, causing it to reel back while letting out a painful whimper of surprise from his sheer physical strength. But the wolf does not back down and bites the branch with even greater fury, making Ju-won curse in anger as he tries to hold off the monster. He flatly refuses to pass away in a place like that and prepares another devastating strike to end the confrontation once and for all, shouting that he is not going to die there, no matter what. The young man's eyes begin emanating an extremely mysterious and powerful blue glow. He throws a violent punch that hits the beast with extreme force, causing the animal to instantly whimper in agony. Right after, he lets out a terrible cry of pain, feeling an intense burning sensation as if his entire body were catching fire. To his complete shock, real flames start bursting directly from his hands and arms, leaving him utterly terrified. Ju-hwan grips the beast's neck with his arm wrapped in fire, asking himself in total shock what kind of bizarre power that is. Ju-hwan looks at his own arm completely engulfed in intense flames, totally unable to comprehend what is going on right there. He uses that fiery power to strike the monster's head with extreme aggression, forcing the giant wolf to slam onto the ground for good. The young man delivers a crushing blow against the beast's neck, which lets out a faint whimper before finally ceasing to move. He unleashes all his built-up strength in repeated, devastating strikes until he is absolutely certain the creature has been taken down. The giant wolf lies completely lifeless on the dark grass, while a faint trail of smoke begins rising from its wounded body. Thoroughly exhausted, Ju-won collapses onto his back on the grass and tries to reason logically about the fire he saw covering his entire arm. He raises his hand and notices his clothes are intact without a single burn mark, which leaves him quite intrigued by the situation. Deep in thought, the young man begins considering the unbelievable possibility that he might have just instinctively used some sort of real magic. He remembers that gaining extraordinary powers upon being transported to a mysterious new world is a well-known fantasy trope. After all, that is one of the most common and recurring tropes in various light novels and fantasy stories of that genre. Curious about the situation, Ju-won decides to test his theory by reaching his hand up into the air while still lying on the grass. He shouts with total conviction for a fireball, expecting a massive magical flame to instantly erupt from his palm. However, absolutely nothing happens, and he keeps repeating the word several times in vain, embarrassing himself completely all alone in the forest. Without giving up, the young man tries other spell variations, shouting hopefully for a firestorm and even a wall of fire. He tries to conjure dragon's breath and even calls upon the earth spirits and fire fairies, but silence continues to reign supreme in the middle of the woods. Realizing that nothing works by voice command, he notices his injuries have healed up a bit, proving that the mysterious power from earlier was not an illusion. The young man reflects that if he can learn to control this special skill, it will definitely be a massive help in his job as a hunter. That way, he would be able to provide a much better life and high-quality food for Lizzie and Dorothy, making them truly happy. On top of everything, living isolated on the mountain with no doctors nearby, he could also use this mysterious power to heal everyone instantly. Ju-won decides to stand up and take it easy, knowing that if the magic awakens spontaneously once, it will definitely happen again in the future. Shortly after losing his parents, Ju-won's grandfather also ended up passing away, leaving him all alone in the world. His grandfather was very strong, but passed away in a tragic accident right after taking him in, leading a relative to aggressively blame him. That man yelled in anger that his father and brother died simply for living with Ju-won, leaving the young guy collapsed on the ground with no reaction. Ju-won was just a regular middle school kid, but all his relatives began treating him as if he were the sole person responsible for all of it. They started viewing the young orphan as though he were a literal jinx who brought nothing but tragedy and misfortune wherever he went. Back in the present, Ju-won considers draining the wolf's blood, but decides against it so he does not attract other forest predators. He hoists the massive beast onto his back to head home right away, planning to skin the animal as soon as he reaches his cabin. He remembers watching his grandfather prepare chickens and rabbits, realizing that memory would finally come in very handy. Walking under the moonlight, Ju-won thinks that his beloved grandfather would definitely feel super proud to see him so strong like this. As he makes his way back, the young man raises his free hand and wonders how he will manage to train and master his new magic. Meanwhile, inside the nicely warmed cabin, Lizzie and little Dorothy look for a few kitchen utensils around the house. With a huge smile on her face, the little girl runs excitedly over to Lizzie to hand her a clean bowl. Lizzie thanks her with lots of affection and gives little Dorothy's head a very gentle stroke, which the child absolutely loves. The little girl lets out a super cute giggle and closes her eyes, thoroughly enjoying that sweet affection from Lizzie. Next, Dorothy begins running happily around the room until coming to a sudden stop, looking toward an opening in the wall. Curious, the girl leans on her hands and peeks through a tiny gap that looks directly out to the exterior of the cabin. However, as she focuses her eyes on what is outside, the little girl gets confused by a strange shadow. She comes face to face with the terrifying snout of a huge wolf and starts crying and screaming in pure panic. The little one runs desperately while screaming, causing Lizzie to turn around in complete shock and call out Dorothy's name instinctively. Lizzie firmly grips a large kitchen knife that was sitting on the table. Ready to defend the family, Lizzie rushes frantically toward the cabin's exit with the knife in hand, ordering little Dorothy to fall back. Her eyes widen in total despair as she sees the horrific scene unfolding right in front of her outside. Ju-won is on his knees trying to carry the giant wolf on his back, but Lizzie assumes he is being fiercely attacked. Without hesitating for a second, she screams in desperation and charges forward with everything she has got to try and save her husband from the monster's clutches. Hearing Lizzie desperately scream his name, Ju-won drops the body of the massive slain animal onto the lawn. Lizzie screams, begging him not to die, while Ju-won gets confused seeing her and little Dorothy running toward him. She suddenly stops and stands completely stunned as she realizes the terrifying predator is actually totally dead. Relieved by the situation, the kitchen knife slips from her trembling hands and falls straight onto the garden grass. Lizzie throws herself into his arms, crying, and checks him over, while he tries to calm her down, saying he is fine and that his injuries vanished. Little Dorothy also comes over, sobbing heavily, and holds onto Ju-won's leg, still deeply frightened by the whole thing. He tries to soothe her, saying it was just a minor bite on his arm and that he is completely recovered now. Under the starry sky, Ju-won repeats that they do not need to worry and that he is truly doing very well. Lizzie hugs him even tighter, weeping out of relief and expressing how happy she feels to see him safe. She keeps repeating over and over that she is relieved, making Ju-won realize just how anxious his absence made her. Seeing little Dorothy whimpering in the exact same tone as Lizzie, he realizes that the two of them were worried sick about him. The young guy feels a bit guilty and reminds himself of the promise that he would never make either of them cry ever again. The next morning, a new day begins in the mountains, and the silence of the forest brings back a sense of peaceful calm. Ju-won starts working early, carefully skinning the giant wolf over a wooden workbench. He grips the knife firmly and separates the hide from the animal's meat, focusing on doing a really clean job. He lets out a tired sigh upon noticing that doing it all alone takes way longer and is much harder than it seemed when his grandfather used to do it. Ju-won scratches his head thoughtfully and decides that on the next hunt, he will have to try a different technique to make the job easier. He focuses back on the task, determined to finish slicing up all the meat from that wolf once and for all. Suddenly, the door opens, and Lizzie steps in slowly, affectionately, calling out the young man's name. Quite surprised, Ju-won immediately looks back upon hearing his wife's voice right there at the entrance. He happily walks over to meet her as he realizes she is carrying a pretty heavy wooden bucket in her hands. She sets the large bucket on the ground and kindly asks the hunter to put all the fresh meat inside it. Lizzie makes friendly gestures indicating that she intends to prepare a delicious meal with the meat he just hunted. Ju-won finally catches on to Lizzie's intentions and feels extremely happy to see the valuable help he is getting from her. He starts racking his brain trying to remember how to say thank you in the language of that mysterious world. Ju-won attempts to stammer out a thank you in a shy and awkward way, leaving Lizzie surprised and not quite understanding the gesture. Lizzie tries to hold back a laugh at Ju-won's awkward attempt to communicate using her language. He gets pretty confused by her reaction, wondering if he somehow pronounced a word wrong. With a warm smile, she gently repeats the phrase correctly to help the young guy learn. Next, she takes a delicate step forward, coming even closer to Ju-won in the middle of the woods. Lizzie softly whispers a sincere thank you, looking deep into his eyes with pure affection. Hearing her words, Ju-won responds naturally. Leaving Lizzie surprised and with blushing cheeks, she reflects that never before in her entire life had she been thanked by her parents or siblings for anything. She finds it amazing how a simple act of bringing a bucket earned such deep gratitude, realizing she is experiencing many firsts with him. As she watches him walk, Lizzie cannot help but fondly recall the first kiss the two shared recently. That romantic memory causes her face to heat up instantly, turning her completely red with embarrassment. Though feeling deeply embarrassed by her own thoughts, Lizzie cannot hold back her heart's curiosity. She begins to wonder if Ju-won had kissed other women in the past, and if they felt the same whirlwind of emotions for him. Sensing a strange tightness in her chest, she realizes her heart is racing, and an unexpected urge to cry begins to bubble up. At that moment, Ju-won places a piece of meat inside the bucket, snapping Lizzie out of her daydream as she steps closer to him. She begins helping him organize the meat, and Ju-won watches her, finding it a bit unique, since women usually handle that task alone. Lizzie feels intrigued as to why he acts like helping her with food. Prep is the most natural thing in the world. Suddenly, Ju-won pauses his work and turns toward her, bringing their gazes together just inches apart. Lizzie enters an internal panic at such close proximity, anxiously wondering what she should do in that romantic moment. Overcome by nervousness and the anticipation of the moment, she squeezes her eyes shut real tight and awaits whatever comes next. However, in an extremely sweet and affectionate manner, Ju-won simply places a soft kiss right on his beloved's forehead. Ju-won gives Lizzie an affectionate, sweet kiss on her forehead, leaving her frozen in surprise at his romantic gesture. She quickly pulls back, calling herself silly and wondering with immense embarrassment why on earth she had closed her eyes. Ju-won simply watches in silence while holding the bucket, not quite knowing what to do in the face of her shy reaction. She panics inside, thinking she might have made it look like she was expecting a passionate kiss on the lips. At that point, the young man steps closer to her again with a slight smile on his face, giving her a little start. She gathers her courage and decides that this time she will not close her eyes no matter what, so he does not misunderstand anything. However, to her absolute shock, Ju-won leans in and kisses her for real on the mouth, leaving her completely stunned. Man, it feels so wild seeing a prota actually take charge for once. I am so here for this. As he pulls back, he flashes a happy smile, glad to have her by his side. Ju-won grabs the bucket and starts walking, but comes to a sudden stop as he spots little Dorothy watching them from the entrance. The little girl peeks out curiously, and Lizzie panics as she realizes the child likely witnessed the couple's entire kiss. Mortified beyond belief, Lizzie dashes away alongside Dorothy, leaving the young guy behind, unable to grasp all the commotion. Shortly after, the three of them walk in single file through the lush green forest on their way to the mountain cabin. While Ju-won carries the heavy bucket, little Dorothy walks right by his side. Trying to help him hold the handle, Ju-won breaks into a massive smile and gently thanks the little one for helping carry the bucket. Dorothy makes a sad little pout, and the young guy tries to understand why, wondering if it is because he did not call her by her name. He fixes his mistake by thanking her again and addressing the girl by name, which makes her tiny eyes sparkle with joy. Super happy, the little girl lets out a wonderful laugh while continuing to hold onto the bucket tightly with her small hands. Now inside the house, Lizzie kneels on the floor and begins gently stroking the huge soft leather of the hunted wolf. Sitting on the floor watching, he grows thoughtful about why she is laying out the animal's hide inside the cabin. But suddenly, a memory or an idea sparks in his mind, and the young man's eyes widen as he realizes the situation. Juwon realizes that wolf pelt must be something incredibly precious to Lizzie. Taking note of her deep care for the item, little Dorothy carefully approaches and crouches down beside Lizzie to also admire the massive pelt of the hunted animal enchanted. The child reaches out her tiny hand and curiously touches the wolf's snout, letting out a sound of pure wonder. Lizzie lets out a super joyful laugh seeing Dorothy's cuteness, filling the entire room with her happiness. Seeing that genuine smile, the hunter feels deeply satisfied knowing he managed to make her truly happy. Lizzie starts preparing juicy steaks, seasoning the meat with great care inside a large wooden basin. Juwon attentively watches every detail of the prep, determined to learn the technique well so he can do it all by himself next time. He notices that she also loved that he saved the animal's fat, feeling relieved for having had that smart idea beforehand. The young man reflects that he still has a long road ahead and needs to learn many new things to live in that world. He wants to understand as quickly as possible how trade and currency value work so he can negotiate pelts fairly. Determined not to waste time, he stands up from the floor to get back to work and gather more firewood for the family cabin. Lizzie suddenly turns around, a bit startled to see that he is already preparing to leave the house again. She gestures with concern, and Juwon asks if she really wants him to stay seated and rest a bit longer. Lizzie shakes her head worriedly, but he smiles and assures her that he has rested enough and is not feeling any pain. He places his hand affectionately on her shoulder and asks her not to worry, promising he will not overexert himself. Lizzie simply watches him leave in silence, still a bit anxious about her companion's well-being. Out in the woods, Juwon finds a medium-sized tree and thinks it is perfect to test his strength and practice. Holding the axe, he regrets not being able to identify an oak, but relies fully on his incredible physical strength for the job. He raises the heavy axe with both arms and delivers a mighty strike against the tree trunk with all his determination. The axe hits the wood with extreme force, generating a violent impact that reverberates directly through the hunter's hands. However, his power was so immense that the axe handle simply snaps right in half, leaving Juwon shocked and speechless. He scratches his head, chuckling nervously at his own absurd strength, not quite knowing how to explain the damage he just caused. Time passes and night begins to slowly settle over the mountains, bringing a cool breeze around the cabin. Juwon opens the door and enters the house carrying a large basket packed with chopped firewood on his back, along with a thick rope. Upon seeing the young man arrive like that, both Lizzie and little Dorothy widen their eyes in absolute amazement. Lizzie desperately rushes over to him and quickly grabs his hand, visibly worried about the young man's condition. Not understanding the reason for all the commotion, Juwon ends up falling onto his bottom on the wooden floor of the room from the scare she gave him. He tries to calm her down, saying he is perfectly fine, while she inspects his arms, searching for any injuries. He flashes an affectionate smile and thanks her for her care and concern under the attentive and curious gazes of little Dorothy. Suddenly, the little girl turns around and starts running hurriedly toward the kitchen, leaving the couple a bit confused by her behavior. Dorothy reaches the bucket of clean water and dips her tiny hands in with great determination to do something. Next, she dashes back to the living room as fast as she can, leaving a trail of water droplets along the floor. She steps up to Juwon and begins splashing the cold water from her hands onto him, leaving the couple in complete shock. At the playful act, Juwon ends up with his face all wet and tries to process what just happened, letting out a slightly awkward laugh. Lizzie bursts out laughing at the fun sight, finding humor in Dorothy's cuteness and her husband's surprised face. The little girl looks at Juwon with her bright eyes filled with anticipation, waiting to see what the young guy's reaction will be. He flashes a sweet smile, cute as a button, thanks Dorothy for the help and softly pats her little blonde head. Excited, Dorothy runs to grab more water, but Juwon and Lizzie laughingly shout that it is plenty and ask her to stop. The young man reaches out his hand trying to stop her while Lizzie keeps laughing, feeling like that happy life is a total dream come true. Juwon reflects that he never imagined he would feel such happiness again in his life, and promises he will do everything to keep them smiling. The quiet comfort of the night settles over the isolated mountain cabin, while the wind softly rustles the leaves outside in the forest. The two enjoy a delicious meal at the table, while little Dorothy, already exhausted, sleeps soundly on her pillow on the floor. Juwon and Lizzie talk in low tones so as not to wake the child, enjoying the calm moment and the great food they prepared together. Dorothy sleeps angelically, clutching a small piece of cutlery, breathing softly and cutely during her deep slumber. Juwon and Lizzie exchange looks filled with affection and softly chuckle at the girl's cuteness, feeling complete on that night, being very careful not to wake her. Juwon picks up little sleeping Dorothy in his arms in an extremely gentle manner. He carries her with ease while Lizzie picks up the fallen utensil from the floor, maintaining the couple's seamless teamwork in caring for her. Juwon slowly walks through the cozy living room lit by the fireplace, heading toward the soft bed to lay the little girl down. He places her on the bed very delicately and covers her up nicely with the warm blanket to make sure she has a great night's rest. Meanwhile, Lizzie goes over to the wood stove and starts tending to a pot of hot water, continuing her evening household chores. Juwon slowly approaches from behind Lizzie while she remains focused on preparing a warm cloth in the kitchen. She turns around and firmly grabs Juwon's wrist by surprise, displaying a very decisive and affectionate attitude. Holding his hand with both of hers, Lizzie looks at him with deep affection, appearing to be on the verge of doing something. The hunter gets a bit confused and quite flushed by his wife's sudden closeness in the middle of the night. The two stand very close to each other in the middle of the illuminated room, creating a super romantic and special vibe between them. Lizzie raises her hands and starts gently rubbing the warm cloth on the back of Juhwan's neck to ease the young man's tension. She massages his neck with deep affection. Cleaning the area with the warm cloth to help him relax after his hard work, Lizzie tries to control her shyness and her racing heart, thinking to herself that this is her sweet duty as a wife. With flushed cheeks, she reaches her hand under Juwon's shirt to start cleaning her husband's back as well. Juwon feels a shiver and tries to hide his surprise, while Lizzie continues wiping his back in a very gentle manner. Juwon simply smiles with immense tenderness at his beloved, sweetly appreciating all that special affection he is receiving. However, Lizzie gets so embarrassed by the situation that she gives up on continuing and quickly pulls back with a super flushed face. Not wanting her to pull away, Juwon acts fast and holds Lizzie's delicate hand in a very affectionate and firm grip. He pulls her close with a gentle smile, making Lizzie's heart leap with emotion at the sudden gesture of affection. Right near her ear, the young man whispers very softly for the two of them to finally go rest for the night. Hand in hand, the couple walks slowly through the dim cabin toward the double bed so they can sleep side by side. The two lie down next to each other cozily, keeping just a single lantern lit to dimly illuminate the bedroom. Juwon leans slightly over her on the bed and gazes at her with immense passion, making Lizzie swallow hard from sheer nervousness. He softly strokes Lizzie's strands of hair with his fingertips, conveying all the love and protection he feels for her. Completely red and happy to receive so much affection, she gives a shy smile while awaiting her beloved husband's touch. With great tenderness, Juwon leans in closer and kisses her softly, sealing that special romantic night once and for all as he kisses her. He thinks about how sweet she is and feels deeply grateful to finally have that incredible woman, as his wife Juwon makes a silent plea for Dorothy and Lizzie to be safe, hoping with all his heart that they never pass away before he does. He mentally begs Santa to never take his family away from him, wishing for the two of them to keep smiling forever. In his thoughts, Juwon reflects on how wealthy nobles live in massive mansions filled with servants and private rooms. However, for regular commoners, reality is vastly different, as kids usually grow up and sleep in the exact same room as their parents. That way, living in the same cramped space, children inevitably end up picking up on their parents' nighttime routines. The young man recalls dark times from her childhood under the covers, hearing her father shout in anger and threaten to hit her mother even harder. That man's violent shouts were terrible to hear, leaving the kids trembling in the dark amidst gasps and terrified crying. Even after her father fell asleep, her poor mother's suppressed crying and gasps kept echoing through the dark bedroom until dawn. That traumatic childhood made young Lizzie grow up feeling a constant fear inside her own home. She used to wonder when she would finally have peaceful nights, fearing that her mother's suffering would end up being her own destiny. Back in the present, Lizzie opens her eyes slowly, gently waking up from her memories of the past. The comforting sound of wood softly crackling in the cabin's fireplace was what ultimately woke the young woman from her sleep. Lizzie is surprised to find herself lying comfortably on the bed, feeling absolutely certain she had fallen asleep on the living room floor. She realizes affectionately that Juwon laid her down there and is even allowing her to use his strong arm as a pillow. Lizzie looks to the side and sees little Dorothy sleeping, peacefully like an angel, feeling a massive sense of comfort in her heart. She feels deeply relieved to realize that couples' nights beside Juwon are infinitely sweeter than anything she had ever known. Lizzie snuggles up close to him and reflects on how her whole life changed for the better ever since she met that incredible man. Suddenly, Juwon lets out a low grumble and starts moving in bed. Catching Lizzie off guard with his sudden waking, Juwon lets out another grumble while pulling her into a very tight, protective hug, leaving Lizzie surprised by the sweet gesture. Her heart races so intensely it feels like it is going to explode at any second from sheer bashfulness and joy. Feeling a wonderful warmth in her chest, she flashes a sweet smile, completely enveloped by that pure emotion, cuddled up with her husband and with little Dorothy by her side. Lizzie wishes from the bottom of her heart that this peaceful moment lasts forever. The next morning, sunlight begins streaming through the crack in the window, while Juwon and Dorothy remain fast asleep. Juwon sits up in bed and carefully adjusts the blanket over Dorothy so the little one stays nice and warm. He gently strokes the girl's blonde hair, smiling as he hears her let out a cute little mumble in her sleep. Meanwhile, Lizzie walks through the cabin carrying an empty metal bucket, ready to start her daily chores. However, suddenly, Juwon's strong hand grabs the bucket handle to help her, catching the young woman completely by surprise. She turns around startled and comes face to face with her husband, smiling gently by her side, indicating he will carry the heavy bucket. Juwon pours out the bucket's water vigorously to start cleaning the area, taking care of his morning duties. He turns toward Lizzie and says something using the language of that world, attempting to communicate the best way he can. Hearing his words, the young woman gets pretty surprised and confused, trying to process what the young man just said to her. Juwon had actually affectionately asked if his dear wife had slept well, but gets confused noticing her face so bright red. She nods her head very shyly, while he wonders if she got so flustered because of the sweet pet name. The hunter breaks into a gentle smile upon realizing that calling her dear or wife was what made the young woman completely flustered. Then, he very kindly asks how Lizzie would like him to address her from then on in that new home. With her cheeks burning with bashfulness, she stammers a bit and whispers asking him to call her dear as well. Juwon lets out a joyful chuckle and instantly repeats the sweet pet name, making Lizzie cover her face, completely red. She turns her back to hide her overwhelming shyness, feeling even the back of her neck burn from how flustered she is by his teasing. Juwon finds Lizzie's reaction extremely cute and feels an uncontrollable urge to tease her even more. He gives her back a light poke with his finger and calls her dear again, playfully asking her to look at him. At that moment, little Dorothy starts waking up in the double bed, rubbing her lazy little eyes and letting out a yawn. Still half asleep, the little girl begins daydreaming about a giant piece of delicious meat floating right in front of her. Driven by hunger, the girl quickly slides out of bed and starts walking hurriedly across the wooden floor. She runs happily with open arms toward the couple, making Juwon and Lizzie look at the little girl in surprise. However, Dorothy zooms right past them without paying the slightest bit of attention, leaving the two adults totally confused. She leans over the edge of the bucket, her eyes sparkling and mouth watering with hunger as she spots the generous chunks of fresh meat. The little one nearly falls headfirst into the bucket to reach the food, making Lizzie and Juwon laugh at her adorable nature. Juwon lets out a playful laugh and happily repeats the word, finding humor in the child's obsession with meat. Dorothy dives headfirst into the bucket, wiggling her little legs and shouting for meat, hyper-focused on getting her food. Juwon lets out a contagious laugh and decides it is time to start hunting for real to feed his family well. He strides firmly through the lush green forest with his new axe, ready to face any beast that crosses his path. The hunter looks proudly at his new iron tool, feeling quite confident that he has a reliable weapon this time. He keeps taking long strides through the damp grass, keeping his eyes and ears sharp for any suspicious noise. Suddenly, Juwon stops walking as he senses a strange shift in the air, noticing that the surrounding atmosphere turned purple and tense. The young guy looks around intrigued, wondering why the forest air suddenly started feeling so heavy and suffocating. He grips the wooden handle of the axe with immense force, finding it surprisingly difficult to breathe even out in the open with a serious and alert expression. The hunter wonders what kind of scary monster is about to pop up in the woods this time. Right then, Juwon spots a mysterious dark figure among the trees, slowly limping toward him across the grass. Juwon gets quite surprised and tense as he stares at the mysterious silhouette, unsure if it is an ally or a new threat. The mysterious figure wearing a hooded black cloak keeps advancing slowly in his direction, making firm footsteps echo through the forest. The hood reveals the stern face of an elderly man with a gray beard, staring at him with an extremely cold, intense gaze. While the two exchange tense, silent looks, Juwon takes the initiative and firmly asks who is standing right there in front of him. The elderly man had been analyzing the scene of the earlier fight, taking note of several rocks stained with fresh blood from a wild beast. He deduces that the massive marks point to a clash with an enormous beast, concluding in awe that Juwon defeated the monster all on his own. The old man reveals he had been watching the cabin for days, noticing that the strong woodcutter did not even know how to handle an axe properly. He finds it unbelievable that such an awkward guy with zero hunting experience managed to take down such a powerful creature. The old man shakes his head thoughtfully, considering it impossible, since even master hunters would struggle immensely to do that unarmed. He steps out of his thoughts and begins speaking to Juwon in the local language, maintaining a very imposing stance before the young hunter. The old man decides he needs to investigate deeply and check things out in person to be absolutely sure about his suspicions. With slow, deliberate steps, he moves toward Juwon, keeping a serious expression under the dark hood of his cloak. As he gets closer, the old man's gaze locks onto the scar marks left on Juwon's arm. He notices they are wolf bite marks, but gets shocked by how clean they are, knowing that any normal person would pass away from fever with such a wound. The old man assesses that Juwon should not be able to move, concluding there is only one logical explanation for that miracle recovery. He swallows hard and starts suspecting if Juwon is actually an exceedingly rare mage capable of using extraordinary healing magic. The old man recalls that mages really do exist in that fantasy world, wielding elemental powers and unbelievable skills. However, mages are legendary and extremely rare figures, making it nearly impossible for common folks to even spot one in their lifetime. He stares thoughtfully at Juwon, fully aware that if that man is truly a mage, the entire situation changes dramatically. The old man breaks into a wide grin, his eyes glowing purple, mentally celebrating that his ultimate golden opportunity has finally arrived. The old man realizes that this golden chance for revenge, which he thought would never come before he passed away, is finally right in front of him. Juwon stares back at him with extreme caution and suspicion, mentally asking himself what kind of mysterious person that old guy really is. He reveals in his thoughts that although he is just a washed-up old man today, he was once a crazy, strong young warrior full of energy. He recalls that upon becoming a forest guardian for a nobleman, serving in the war was mandatory, where a great performance would bring immense prestige. Because of that, he had left his father's house as an independent hunter and headed to a distant village to become the local woodcutter. It did not take long for him to secure the position, knowing that the surrounding mountain was insanely rich in valuable timber and game. The only issue was the competition in gathering, since even regular commoners were permitted to enter the lord's lands to collect firewood. With no other way to stand out, he had no choice but to start venturing deeper and deeper into the dangerous parts of the mountain. At the time, he thought it would be a great opportunity to map out the terrain, not understanding why the villagers only gathered firewood at the safe edges. The young man was unaware of the crucial rule that a forest guardian needed to have all bodily limbs intact upon signing the contract. Unfortunately, right before closing the official deal, he suffered a horrific tragedy in the woods that ended up disqualifying him from the job for good. He cries desperately in the middle of the darkness, bitterly mourning the cruel fate he never imagined he would have to face in life. The young woodcutter ended up discovering the hard way that a terrifying horde of cruel goblins inhabited the interior of that mountain, hidden in the hollow of a tree. He trembled in sheer horror as he heard the roars of the fierce creatures echoing close to his hiding spot. He explains the horror of those monsters, who kidnap human women to force them to give birth to a new generation of cruel goblins. Because of that, the local village, which was already suffering from a shortage of women, fell into absolute despair due to the constant attacks. The region became known as the Goblin Village, and he began enduring a miserable life, focused solely on getting his revenge one day. He lost his leg and had his life ruined, harboring a deep hatred for the monsters and even for the cowardly villagers. The old man wept in rage, remembering that he endured living for decades among the villagers with the single thought of one day destroying those cursed monsters. He fought bravely to survive no matter what, dreaming of the day he would burn that whole lair of cruel beasts to ashes as he looks at Juwon. The old man realizes with conviction that the young hunter is finally the warrior who possesses all the power required for that. He admires the young man's enviable and unmatched physical build, owner of incredible muscle mass and strength fit for a true giant. On top of all his impressive raw strength, Juwon also proves to possess an unbelievable, absurd capacity for physical regeneration. The old man is certain that he has the potential to become the most powerful and fearless monster hunter the world has ever seen. He knows the monsters are hidden in the mountain, but that they will soon attack the village again looking for women once theirs run out. Because of that, the old man plans to train Juwon relentlessly until turning him into an elite monster hunter before the worst happens. He decides to conceal the existence of the monsters until they seal the deal for good, knowing that afterward the young guy will not be able to break the agreement and run. In response, Juwon bows respectfully before the old man and politely thanks him for the valuable help he is receiving. The old man notices, impressed, that even while bowing warmly, Juwon maintains his center of gravity rock solid and does not drop his guard for a single second. The old guy warmly extends his hand and lets the young man know that from that moment on, he will personally teach him everything he knows about hunting. He praises Ju-won, saying he will make a brilliant hunter, leaving the young man a bit intrigued and confused by the old man's words. The next morning, Ju-won stretches and runs excitedly as he notices that daylight has broken and that Lizzie and Dorothy are already prepping food. Curious, the young guy looks toward the cabin window to check the weather outside. Before starting his new hunting training for the day, Ju-won spots the old man waiting outside and reflects that he does not want strangers stepping into his house, thinking of his family's safety. He decides to protect his home from any unexpected visitors, wanting to keep Lizzie and little Dorothy completely safe and protected at all times. The hunter puts on his vest and steps out of the cabin quickly, coming face to face with the hooded old man who was waiting patiently for him. Seeing the old guy's expression, Ju-won thinks to himself that that friendly smile actually hides pretty suspicious ulterior motives. He finds that look identical to the fake smile of an HR manager during salary negotiations at his old job back on Earth. Setting suspicions aside, he grabs his canvas bag and decides to focus on giving his absolute best to learn the valuable hunting techniques. Ju-hwan turns to his wife and gently lets her know that everything is fine and promises not to take long to return home after. Training Lizzie gets blushing cheeks and lets out a shy sigh, showing a certain cuteness and awkwardness while prepping a lunch pack for her husband. Watching that sweet scene, Ju-hwan cannot contain a silly smile, finding his sweet wife incredibly cute and dedicated. Little Dorothy attentively watches every detail of the scene with curiosity, while Lizzie finishes wrapping up the food with care. Suddenly, the little girl turns with determination and starts running hurriedly across the room toward the cabin exit. With tons of energy, Dorothy pushes the doors open and stands in the doorway, stretching out her tiny arms to block Ju-won's exit, leaving the hunter confused by the scene. She shouts, reminding him about the food pack, making Lizzie hurry over to her husband carrying the neatly wrapped package in her hands. Lizzie places the food package in his bag very delicately, softly asking with blushing cheeks for him to eat properly. Ju-won looks back and breaks into an extremely happy smile, thinking about how wonderful it is to finally have a family that cares so much about him. Lizzie says goodbye, wishing him a good journey, and the young man walks confidently, perfectly understanding the meaning of those sweet words. With a smile on his face, he points his index finger and replies by repeating the phrase in her language to wish his beloved a great day. Lizzie nods her head and gives a beautiful, gentle smile, deeply happy and touched by her husband's gesture. As Ju-won prepares to head out with his pack, Lizzie calls out for little Dorothy, who points curiously at the food. The little girl runs excitedly over to him and joyfully wishes for him to have a safe journey free of dangers in the forest. He waves his hand very affectionately and promises the little Dorothy that he will come running back home real soon, walking alongside the old man. Ju-won laughingly thinks it is a problem, because his new family is so gentle that he does not even want to leave home. He feels extremely happy to see that he has a wife and an adopted daughter who are so mind-blowingly cute and loving, taking care of him. As they venture deeper into the dense woods, the young man begins asking himself in his thoughts how long exactly the two of them have been walking. He starts sweating from fatigue and feels intrigued about what the old hunter wants to show him that is requiring such a long trek. Suddenly, the old hunter comes to a dead stop and speaks something in the local dialect, leaving Ju-won surprised and on guard. The old man points at the ground, and Ju-won looks over in confusion, asking himself if he should focus his attention directly at the master's feet. The old man starts walking calmly again along the dirt trail, displaying an impeccable posture with every step he takes. Ju-won focuses on the tracks and notices with strangeness that the footprints left in the dirt by the old man have a very peculiar pattern. The young guy's eyes widen, and he gets completely shocked as he analyzes the master's stepping pattern in front of him with closer attention. Ju-won reflects, impressed, that man's stride is bizarre and that his footprints on the sandy ground are extremely uncommon. He wonders if that is some secret movement technique from martial arts manuals to anchor oneself and maintain balance on the terrain. Ju-won decides that if he wants to master that trick, he will have to attentively observe every single movement to perfectly copy the steps. He starts walking heavily and firmly in the woods, forcing his feet against the ground to try to mimic the master the best way possible. Concentrated on his copying task, Ju-won moves with long strides while the old hunter glances back out of the corner of his eye to watch him. The old guy lets out a subtle, satisfied smirk upon seeing the young man's focus and effort in trying to learn his method from there on out. The old hunter begins truly guiding Ju-won through the woods and teaching him the secrets of survival on the wild mountain. He has the young man touch the tree trunks and explains that every mountain in the world possesses its own native plant species. He also helps the young guy memorize the terrain, having him use his hands and a wooden stick to draw the mountain's shape on the ground. Juhwan sits on a tall rock to catch his breath under the strong sun, while the master remains standing, watching him attentively. In a very calm manner, the old man reaches his hand inside his small leather pouch to grab an item he brought along. He pulls out a wooden pipe from inside the pouch, getting ready to enjoy a moment of rest right there in the middle of the woods. Next, the master points at Juwan's bag, making the young guy get super hyped as he notices that the long-awaited mealtime has finally arrived. Super excited, Juwan opens his canvas bag. Eager to savor the delicious meal Lizzie prepared with so much love for him, he gets comfortable and opens the lid of the metal box with great care, feeling his mouth water with hunger, just imagining the food's taste. Seeing the fried egg and appetizing meat, the young guy praises the amazing aroma, but the old man frantically yells for him to close the lunchbox right that instant. Totally confused by the forceful reaction, Juhwan looks back while the master points angrily in his direction, ordering him to cover up the food. The old man makes gestures of refusal, waving his hand and pointing toward the horizon, making it crystal clear that opening food right there was a massive hunting error. He explains that the strong scent of seasoned food spreads extremely fast through the wind, instantly alerting all the animals in the area. Saddened, Juwan closes the lid, knowing that all of Lizzie's effort to prep the food ended up going to waste because of hunting rules. The young man gets teary-eyed from sheer disappointment and a desire to cry, while the master simply watches him with a serene look. Juwan walks back to the cabin downcast with his bag on his back, lamenting not being able to enjoy his wife's delicious lunch. Suddenly, the old master grumbles and steps out from inside the cabin, bringing along 2 extremely long wooden bows in his hands. Juhwan scratches his chin, intrigued, thinking that the shape of those bows is super weird, since the only ones he knew were curved. He keeps wondering in his mind how anyone would be able to shoot an arrow using a weapon that is so straight and long. The master extends one of the weapons, ordering Juwan to take the longbow and follow him to begin practical shooting practice. Juwan follows him across the green meadow holding the bizarre bow, still heavily doubting if that thing is actually going to work on a hunt. He watches the master take his stance and thinks that pulling a string on a massive weapon like that must require purely insane strength. The old man raises his arm with firmness and begins pulling the string of the massive bow high up, preparing to make the perfect shot. Even holding a heavy weapon, he stays rock solid without moving a single millimeter, looking as if time itself had stopped around him. He releases the string, and the arrow is launched, slicing through the wind with brutal speed and power, heading straight toward the distant target. The projectile hits the tree trunk with a violent thud, sinking deep into the thick wood due to the sheer power. Juwan gets extremely impressed and deep in thought seeing the arrow smoking in the tree, realizing that that is the ultimate technique. Determined to try it too, the young hunter takes his stance and raises the giant bow with power, pulling the string with heavy focus on the target. However, the old man approaches him and places his hand on his shoulder in a calm manner to fix the young man's improper posture. Juwan gets a slight startle seeing the master touch him, but quickly realizes he is teaching him how to stay rock solid and still for the shot, concentrating all his attention on the master's correction. The young man locks his sight on the tree to attempt to execute the perfect shot. Juwan reflects on the words and movement techniques he learned that day to become a true hunter. He knows he needs to train with heavy dedication to manage on his own and take care of everything as quickly as possible on the mountain. The hunter locks his determined gaze, keeping the solid promise to become a man capable of properly supporting his beloved wife and daughter. Meanwhile, a beautiful sunny day shines over the isolated wooden cabin, bringing a wonderful calm to that morning. Dorothy lies on the bed swinging her tiny legs and happily humming a tune about Juwan, Lizzie, and the delicious red meat she ate. She rubs her super full little belly with satisfaction, feeling as though the delicious meat were even growing inside her stomach. Dorothy turns around and gets surprised to see Lizzie laughing so spontaneously and joyfully while on her knees on the living room floor. The little one notices that Lizzie has been smiling a lot ever since Juwan's arrival, remembering that before, neither of them used to laugh like that. The girl feels a cozy warmth in her chest upon hearing her laugh, as if she were sitting right next to a warm fireplace. She hopes her little belly empties out soon so she can eat more meat, but suddenly finds herself wondering who Jaehwan really is to her. Dorothy tries to understand if Jaehwan is Lizzie's husband, and what exactly that muscular giant represents in her small life from here on out. Knowing that neither of them are her blood parents, she silently fears that they might abandon her one day, just like her former father did. The little one asks herself with anguish if Jaehwan, being husband only to Lizzie, would decide to take only her away from her life in the future. With her tiny eyes brimming with tears, the girl asks herself with great sadness what would happen to her if she ended up being left behind. Suddenly, Dorothy is snapped out of her sad thoughts by a strange noise coming from outside the cabin and goes on high alert. She sits up in bed and looks around, frightened, as she realizes Lizzie suddenly vanished from the room, leaving the space completely empty. A terrifying fear takes hold of Dorothy as she hears aggressive shouts outside, calling her a useless girl, making her body tremble. She recalls past traumas, back when a man used to verbally abuse her, saying she was a useless burden who only wasted food. Focused on helping out, the little girl runs frantically to try to hide and save Juwan's precious meat from any wicked intruder. Upon seeing that the meat is safe for now, Dorothy gets worried and wonders where Lizzie could have gone in such a hurry. Suddenly, a deep and intimidating voice echoes through the cabin, harshly asking what on earth she thinks she is hiding right there. Terrified by the sudden confrontation, little Dorothy leaps in shock and looks toward the sound with wide, terrified eyes. She peeks fearfully through a tiny crack in the wooden door of the cabin, trying to make sense of what is happening in the garden. Dorothy spots 3 burly men from the village standing outside with intimidating expressions and holding wooden weapons. She shakes in terror upon recognizing those cowardly men who used to invade the place to threaten and brutally beat her former father. The little girl gets terrified for Lizzie, silently fearing that her adopted mother might end up being beaten to death by those cruel intruders. One of those men grabs Lizzie aggressively by the arm, accusing her of stealing their meat, while she desperately denies it in tears. "Scumbags, do not you dare lay a hand on our waifu." She tries to explain with difficulty that it was her husband who hunted and brought the animal, but the attacker mocks her, saying hunting is not that easy. The man yells in anger, saying Lizzie's husband passed away and left her with nothing, accusing her of being an ungrateful thief after they gave her a home. Lizzie cries desperately, insisting that her new husband really did hunt the beast, but the men threaten to raid the cabin to steal everything. Without a shred of mercy, the attacker screams at her to shut her mouth and delivers a violent blow against Lizzie, shoving her hard onto the grassy ground. The 3 intruders enter the cabin without ceremony and start looking around greedily in search of any valuable item to steal. The leader of the group stops in shock upon spotting the massive wolf pelt displayed in the living room, unable to believe it is such a huge hide. With a greedy smile on his face, he strokes the giant wolf's soft pelt and celebrates, saying that rarity is worth a literal fortune. He immediately orders his goons to search every corner of the cabin to steal absolutely everything they can find hidden underneath a nearby table. Little Dorothy shakes in absolute horror as she hears the men approaching and looking for meat, with her heart racing in terror. The little girl desperately hopes those wretched men fail to find her hiding spot. Outside, Lizzie pushes herself up from the ground with great determination and desperately runs back inside the cabin to protect her belongings. She places herself in front of the giant wolf pelt with open arms, bravely shouting for the intruders not to touch her treasure. With tears streaming down her face, the young woman bravely insists that that pelt belongs to her and her husband, refusing to back down. The attacker steps up to her with disdain, irritably commenting that Lizzie suddenly decided to stand up to them just because she managed to score a new husband. Without a moment's hesitation, the cowardly man delivers a violent slap to Lizzie's face, making her scream in pain from the sheer force of the impact. From the brutal force of the hit, the young woman is thrown onto the wooden floor of the cabin. Striking her head hard and falling unconscious, Lizzie groans in pain on the floor with the corner of her mouth bleeding slightly, completely defenseless before the boundless cruelty of those attackers hidden nearby. Little Dorothy watches that entire violent scene in absolute shock and terror, seriously fearing for her mother's life. Her eyes get filled with tears, and her face stays frozen in horror, seeing the pitiful state Lizzie was left in on the living room floor. Lizzie looks toward Dorothy with deep sadness and worry in her wounded gaze, fearing that the bad men might also hurt the little one. Dorothy panics inside upon sensing the danger, recalling how she used to pretend to know nothing in the past to manage to survive, crying heavily on her knees in her tight hiding spot. The child frantically asks herself what she must do to save herself and Lizzie. Meanwhile, the attackers keep mocking Lizzie lying on the floor, wondering with disdain what will happen if the mountain guardian finds out about everything. The attackers comment that Juwan does not even understand their language, so keeping quiet will be enough to ensure no one discovers the robbery. The leader of the group forcefully pulls Lizzie by the arm and suggests that they simply head out into the forest. He gives notice that he will take the woman while telling the others to grab the stuff, making Lizzie groan in pain as she gets grabbed. The man threatens to return at night to burn down the cabin if she says anything to her husband, while Lizzie begs him to stop as he drags Lizzie along while the others carry the loot. The leader mocks, hoping nothing goes wrong, celebrating that he struck gold. Dorothy emerges from her hiding spot, devastated as she sees Lizzie being carried away, knowing something awful is going to happen to her. The little girl runs desperately, crying heavily, terrified by the possibility of her mother never returning. She halts near the door, looking outside, trying to hold back her sobs. Unable to contain herself, Dorothy breaks down into loud crying, shedding many tears of pure desperation. Standing on a box, she screams out Ju-hwan's name, desperately begging for him to come back soon. Through the window, the attackers can be seen carrying off the stolen goods and dragging Lizzie into the forest. As he walks through the forest with the hooded old man, an exhausted Ju-hwan comments that day felt insanely long. The old hooded man points toward the cabin, causing Ju-hwan to look intently at the place. Ju-hwan bows respectfully and sincerely thanks him from the bottom of his heart for all the help he received on that hunting day. Suddenly, loud crying echoes from afar, startling Ju-hwan as he recognizes Dorothy's voice. He looks tensely toward his cabin, knowing full well that Dorothy would never cry in such a frantic way. Concerned, he begins picking up his pace, wondering if something terrible happened at his house. Ju-hwan runs as fast as he can through the forest, fearing that something bad might have happened to Lizzie or Dorothy midway there. He suddenly spots the trio of men carrying his stolen belongings and dragging Lizzie along. I really hope the Prota beat the living lights out of these scumbags. Overcome with fury, Ju-hwan screams with hatred that he is going to destroy whoever is responsible for that. The red-haired goon hears the noise and turns around, confused to see who is coming up behind him. Ju-hwan charges forward with everything he has got and lands a devastating punch directly on the man's face, making blood splatter. The man is launched violently onto the ground, leaving the other two accomplices in absolute shock. Lizzie looks at her husband with relief and whispers his name. While Ju-hwan maintains an extremely stern expression, Ju-hwan takes firm, slow steps toward the attackers, while the goon sprawled on the ground groans in pain. The man holding the wolf pelt begins breaking into a cold sweat of terror as he senses the Prota's intimidating aura. Without giving them time to react, Ju-hwan delivers a violent kick right to the face of the second attacker. The attacker collapses onto the ground, bleeding heavily, while the blonde leader watches that scene in sheer horror. Desperate, the blonde leader tries to fight back and lunges, throwing a punch toward Ju-hwan's face. But the Prota dodges with agility and grabs the man by the waist with all his raw strength. With his extraordinary power, he hoists the blonde leader up into the air, plunging the man into full-blown panic. Ju-hwan slams the intruder's body down with brutal force directly onto the forest floor. He mounts the fallen attacker and raises his fist, knowing he cannot stop hitting now. He pummels the leader's face violently, reflecting that human nature is filthy and that he refuses to be played for a fool. He stands tall, staring down at the fallen men, determined to engrave this lesson into them, so those scumbags never return. He reaches down to grab a wooden staff from the fallen leader, leaving Lizzie frightened by the sight. Lizzie desperately screams out his name, causing Ju-hwan to freeze mid-motion and look over at her in confusion. The blonde leader gets up, holding a scythe, and tries to attack him from behind, while Lizzie screams frantically for him to watch out. But Ju-hwan reacts in a split second and grabs the man's wrist right before getting struck by the scythe. With a swift movement, the Prota snaps the attacker's arm, sending the man into agonizing screams of pain. Ju-hwan grits his teeth, his eyes flashing with pure rage, while the intruder keeps screaming in agony. The old hunter comes rushing over and shouts for Ju-hwan to stop that violence immediately. He firmly holds Ju-hwan's arm, sternly demanding that he calm down once and for all. Next, the old man points toward the cabin and asks if he cannot see how terrified his own daughter is. Lizzie looks at her husband with a blend of concern and sadness, remaining in absolute silence. From the cabin window, little Dorothy continues to cry heavily upon witnessing that terrifying situation. Hearing that, Ju-hwan glances back toward the cabin, and his aura of rage slowly begins to fade away. Lizzie reflects that he always seemed like someone so gentle he did not even know how to get mad, but she ended up discovering a terrifying rage in him. She also thinks that for a split second, while he was beating those men, Ju-hwan made her remember her late husband. Seeing the men sprawled out, she confesses that she felt a sudden fear of also ending up getting hit by him. But the moment she looked into Ju-hwan's eyes, that fear vanished, as she realized those eyes did not want to frighten her. In truth, they were eyes that were desperately trying to protect her from all danger. And right now, Ju-hwan's gaze looks like that of someone who thinks she is terrified of him. Ju-hwan softly calls out her name, trying to break the silence between the two. She wonders why the reaction of a worthless woman like her would worry and frighten him so much. She realizes there is nothing left to fear, but she still trembles, and that is why he thinks she is scared of him. Deep down, Lizzie begs her husband not to wear such a hurt and sad expression. Saying she is not afraid of him would be easy, but since they do not understand each other's language, she needs to act differently. Even while trembling heavily, Lizzie reaches out her hand with affection toward Juwon. She calls out Juwon's name with a shaky voice, attempting to comfort her husband. The two take slow steps until they stand very close to each other in the middle of the forest. Juwon holds Lizzie's hands with delicate care and flashes a relieved, affectionate smile. The moment Lizzie feels the warmth of his hands, she knows one thing with absolute certainty in her heart. She feels that by his side, she will always be safe, and no one will ever be able to hurt her again. With affection, Lizzie softly presses his hand against her own cheek. With tears in her eyes and a beautiful smile, she thanks him from the bottom of her heart for saving her. Juwon gets surprised and deeply moved by that sweet gesture full of gratitude. He strokes Lizzie's face and speaks her name with immense tenderness. He wraps her in a warm, tight hug while she keeps repeating her thanks, while comforting her in his arms. Juwon wonders why she feels so grateful. He closes his eyes and reflects that in reality, he is the one who should be thanking her for everything. Suddenly, Lizzie widens her eyes in shock as she remembers something urgent. She remembers that little Dorothy is still over at the cabin, crying her eyes out. She quickly points toward the house and calls her husband so they can go check on the girl. Without wasting a moment, Lizzie runs toward the cabin shouting for Dorothy. With Juwon right behind her, Lizzie dashes inside and asks if little Dorothy is okay, seeing that she is still shaking. However, she gets surprised by the girl's reaction upon seeing her walk, and Dorothy remains standing on top of the box with her hands clasped, trembling in terror. She remembers asking for help, but seeing Juhwan's massive fists hitting those men was terrifying. In her mind, memories of her stepmother's and Lizzie's swollen, heavily bruised faces pop up. She feels horror at the thought of ending up with a bruised face and knows she cannot cry, otherwise she will be hit even more. The girl thinks she needs to apologize to Lizzie before she gets treated like a ghost, just like her stepmother used to do. Reaching out her tiny arms, she apologizes for hiding and begs not to be left alone. With tears streaming down, Dorothy whimpers softly, saying that all of this was her fault. Lizzie hugs her with immense force and worriedly asks what on earth the little girl is talking about. She explains through tears that she only pretended not to know her earlier because she was scared those men would find her. She assures her that Dorothy is not to blame for anything at all, making the girl ask if that is really true. Lizzie says that everything is fine now because Daddy is here, but Dorothy gets confused. Since her father passed away, Lizzie asks if she knows who Juwon is, and the girl replies that he is just Lizzie's husband. The mother explains that since Juwon is her husband, that also makes him Dorothy's daddy, leaving the child stunned. She reminds the girl that she is her stepmother, and Dorothy agrees that she is. She adds that if Dorothy is her daughter, then Juwon is her father, leaving the little girl in complete shock. Dorothy looks through the window and sees Juwon from behind standing outside, repeating the word daddy with curiosity. She points toward him and asks if he really is her daddy, and Lizzie confirms it with a smile. She lovingly explains that Juwon is very different from her old father because he does not hit them, but rather protects them. The little girl realizes that he fought those bad men specifically to defend them because he is her dad. Understanding everything now, Dorothy quickly hops off the box and runs excitedly toward the cabin door. She breaks into a giant smile and shouts with all her might, calling out for her new daddy. Dorothy thinks that that massive man with giant hands and feet is now officially her daddy. She runs happily outside, knowing she has a crazy, strong, and amazing dad to protect her and Lizzie. Dorothy reflects that he does not hit her and always hugs her with affection at night when they all sleep together. She also remembers that he smiles at her, always gives her meat to eat, and even gave her her real name. Thinking that the person who gave her her name is her dad leaves her insanely happy and amazed. Hearing the little girl shout calling for daddy, Juwon turns around, extremely startled and surprised. He stays completely speechless as he sees, through the reflection in his eyes, the girl running happily toward him. Without hesitation, the Prota opens his arms wide to welcome the little one with deep affection. Juwon kneels on the grass and wraps her in a warm embrace under the moonlight while she celebrates happily. He notices that Dorothy is shouting words in an unknown language, but senses that he understands the exact meaning of every single one. Affectionately, he hoists the girl into his arms and holds her firm, a gentle smile plastered on his face. However, suddenly he starts sniffing the air and wonders, confused, what that strange smell coming from the girl is. Looking down, Juan notices that Dorothy's clothes are pretty wet and discovers that the little one ended up peeing her pants. She looks so innocent that he feels bad for noticing, thinking he needs to change her clothes right away to prevent her from catching a cold. At that point, Lizzie comes running out to join the two in the garden of the property. Juan pulls both of them into a super tight, joyful hug, letting out a genuine laugh of pure relief. However, little Dorothy soon remembers something of extreme importance and shouts, asking where the meat is. She dashes down from his arms, sprinting toward the forest, screaming frantically for food. Lizzie shouts worriedly for the girl, who zooms right past the unconscious bodies of the attackers lying on the grass. Without giving a single care about the knocked-out men, the little girl keeps running as fast as her legs can take her. She finally stops upon finding the wooden bucket packed with big, juicy steaks of fresh meat. With a face full of absolute determination, the child starts using all her strength to try to lift the heavy bucket. She pulls so hard that she ends up wobbling backward with the massive bucket of meat clutched in her tiny arms. Juan and Lizzie run desperately toward her, shouting her name, terrified by the weight she is carrying. With a grimace and gritted teeth, the girl's face turns red from sheer effort to not drop the bucket. She starts stubbornly dragging the heavy bucket, leaving Juan completely shocked by such insane willpower. The proto reflects that the girl's obsession with meat is terrifying, while Lizzie lets out a quiet giggle beside him. He steps up and grabs the bucket to help the little one, who looks up with eyes sparkling with anticipation. With effortless ease, Juan lifts the bucket with Dorothy dangling from it, making the girl let out an excited cheer. He notices the girl's gaze of deep admiration over a simple bucket of meat, thinking that being a hero is insanely easy. Clapping her hands, Lizzie tells her husband to bring the meat inside the cabin so they can prepare the meal. She also asks him to bring Dorothy inside the house, warning that it is still dangerous. Outside, Dorothy runs super excited into the cabin shouting for meat, while Juan follows close behind. The proto leans against the doorframe and lets out a long sigh of relief that everything is finally resolved. But shortly after, he steps out of the house again and walks toward the fallen attackers on the grass who are still groaning in pain. Looking at those cowards, Juan's eyes begin glowing again with a dark rage. However, the old hunter steps right into Juan's path out of nowhere, causing him to come to an abrupt stop. The old man gestures, saying he should not beat up or eliminate anyone, and Juan questions if he really ought to spare them. Juan silently agrees, aware that it would be a massive headache if he ended up locked up or enslaved again because of those guys. He looks toward the cabin and remembers that now he has a real family and is no longer alone in this world. With a deadly glare, he burns the face of each one into his memory, knowing that if they cross his path again, they will face a fate worse than passing away. The old hunter gives friendly pats on his shoulder. Relieved to see that the proto listened to his advice, Juan decides he should at least take their toolbox, since those are essential survival items for anyone living on the mountain. Looking inside the house, he sees Lizzie and little Dorothy hugging and laughing happily in the brightly lit living room with a warm smile. He steps inside carrying the toolbox and the valuable giant wolf pelt on his shoulders. He crouches in a corner of the cabin to organize and store all the new tools he just acquired. While putting the belongings away, the proto reflects that losing a family once was already more than enough in his life. He flashes a slight, determined smile, swearing on his soul that he will not let anything bad happen to them from now on. He turns to look toward Lizzie and Dorothy and promises himself that he will do whatever it takes to protect the two of them. With extreme care, he runs his fingers over the bruise on Lizzie's face, wishing he had magic to heal her instantly. Lizzie smiles tenderly and lightly squeezes his cheeks, cheerfully assuring him that she is completely fine. Juan gets flustered with his cheeks squished, while she lets out a fun giggle seeing her husband's funny face. Suddenly, Juan scoops Lizzie up in his arms without warning, leaving the young woman totally surprised by the sudden action. He comments that the floor is too cold for her to stand barefoot, leaving Lizzie flustered and surprised by the affection. Looking very closely at Lizzie's face, the proto notices something unbelievable and gets shocked. He notices that the massive bruise that was on his wife's face vanished entirely, without leaving a single mark behind. The proto mentally asks himself if the magic practice he did earlier actually worked. He breaks into a huge, radiant smile as he realizes he can finally use actual healing magic for real. Lizzie, on the other hand, just stares at him, completely unable to grasp the reason for so much sudden joy. Meanwhile, in the nearby village, someone angrily complains if that idiot has completely lost his mind for good. A woman kicks a feisty chicken that fails to recognize its own owner and complains that the animal is always meddling where it should not. The village chief shows up behind her and asks if giving a bit of fabric to the mountain guardian bothers her that much. He says they need the guardian, but she complains that she kept that precious fabric for 10 years, to which he replies that he had no choice. The chief explains that the young guy seemed used to fighting, and that if more people pass away or get hurt, the year's harvest will be ruined. He calls her foolish for not seeing the bigger picture, but she talks back, asking how big that plan is for him to give away her fabric so easily. The chief recalls seeing that the young man's beast bite wounds, which were not even there before, were healing at an incredible speed. He concludes that what Gus said must be true, meaning that mountain guardian is actually a healing mage. The chief reflects that he needs to act with extreme caution, because even nobles would love to have a powerful mage like that. He thinks that if even royalty takes an interest in the young man, he could sell him for an absolute fortune. With a greedy smile, he dreams that if everything works out, he will be able to live a life vastly superior to that of a simple village chief. He knows no one has found out about the healing mage yet, and that the villagers are way too foolish to notice anything. But if rumors leak and some noble or guild captures the young man before he makes a single coin, that will be a massive problem. The only person he can trust is the old hunter Gus, who must keep an eye on the young guy while he searches for an interested noble. He orders his wife to try to get along with the guardian's wife, revealing that Gus said the young man learned to hunt really fast. The chief warns that the young guy is on another level, and that if they are not careful, he might discover that they divert goods. He adds that the young man adores his wife and suggests that if she becomes her friend, maybe they can get rabbit pelts really cheap. The wife agrees and walks away, commenting that either way, there are things that women need to do together. The man reflects that they should return some of the items they took from the guardian's cabin earlier. He leans down to gather twigs, knowing that the young guy is very different from the others, and that failing to act now will bring future trouble. Next, he throws the pieces of wood directly into the lit fire of the stone furnace. Watching the flames rise high, he murmurs that it is a shame to have to do that, but that unfortunately there is no other alternative. With an evil glare before the flames, he reflects that sometimes you have to give up a little meat to get the bones. A few days pass at the mountain cabin, and a cheerful whistling sound echoes peacefully around the property. Walking in a relaxed manner, Juwon notices with satisfaction that Lizzie seems to be very happy again on that day. Lizzie is on her knees looking at the new supplies the chief sent that morning, thinking that just a single piece of fabric was not enough. He wonders if receiving old belongings back would make her so happy, since she did not even celebrate that much when her bruise vanished. Juhwan flashes a light smile seeing her, and reflects that watching Lizzie reminds him that true happiness lies in the small things he approaches with affection, and thinks that that is precisely why he loves her so much and takes pride in having a woman like her by his side. The young guy kindly lets her know he is heading out to hunt, leaving Lizzie a bit surprised as she asks where he is going. The two tease each other and laugh while he cheerfully says goodbye to start his hunting for the day. Juhwan waves goodbye as he steps out the door, and Lizzie returns the wave, lovingly asking him to take care of himself walking through the yard. He remembers that the old hunter Gus had mentioned he was going to hunt rabbits that day. Juhwan steps into a woodshed and wonders curiously if they will actually manage to catch any rabbit today. He heavily roots for them to succeed, especially because of Dorothy, since the little girl is always begging for meat. However, holding a hatchet in his hand, he swallows hard and questions if he will really have the heart to end a cute little rabbit. Shaking his head to brush away those thoughts, he repeats that to pull off being a hunter, he needs to drop his modern sensitivity. Despite his resolve, he still hesitates when thinking about how gentle and defenseless a little bunny can seem. The young guy mentally confesses that every time he imagines a fluffy white bunny, he cannot help a funny mental image. He blushes, admitting that he always remembers his wife, who looks just like a rabbit, making it impossible to think about taking one down. Walking through the forest, he playfully jokes in his mind, hoping that if he encounters a rabbit, the animal turns out to be super ugly. Suddenly, a terrifying creature pops up out from among the bushes. Juwan steps out of the cabin with a tired look, running his hand through his hair and letting out a long sigh after finishing his chores. He thinks to himself that he has already fetched water and chopped all the firewood, but realizes he still has plenty of free time left before setting off. Stretching his arms to relax his muscles, the young man wonders if he should take the opportunity to practice a bit of his magic. He reflects that healing wounds has become second nature, but he still cannot create even a single spark of fire. He remains puzzled, wondering why fire magic had worked so intensely during that moment of rage in the past. The young man tries to find an explanation, wondering if the magic only manifested that way because it was an emergency situation. He tries to focus deeply, channeling all his attention into circulating the inner energy directly within his power core. Suddenly, he extends his hand forward with conviction and loudly shouts the name of a technique, trying to summon a firestorm. Seeing that nothing happened, he sighs and thinks that, since he wasn't expecting much anyway, he isn't even disappointed by the failure. He thinks that Dorothy would love to see fire, since healing magic doesn't glow or make cool sound effects, so the little girl isn't really impressed. He bites his lip in frustration, thinking to himself that he really wanted to show her a bit of fire and that it's a real shame. Suddenly, tiny, bright sparks and crackling flames start sprouting right at the tips of his fingers, taking Juhwan by surprise. He celebrates that he managed to create fire, but gets self-conscious upon noticing that the flame is tiny, looking just like the flame from a lighter. Right at that moment, little Dorothy walks out of the cabin still looking sleepy, rubbing one of her eyes with her little hand. But the next second, her little golden eyes widen in absolute shock as she sees what the young man is doing outside overjoyed. The little girl points in his direction and shouts happily that her daddy's hand is literally producing fire. Juhwan warns her not to get close so she doesn't get burned, but she says excitedly that she needs to tell mommy about the fire magic. Dorothy holds his hand and stares in utter amazement with sparkling eyes at the small flame flickering on Juhwan's finger. Lizzie comes running out of the cabin, calling for the little girl with concern in her voice, rushing toward the two in the yard. She stops abruptly and covers her mouth in absolute shock upon spotting the fire coming directly from Juhwan's hand. He feels happy to see that both of them loved it and wishes he could make the flame bigger, thinking that at least now he can light campfires. However, Lizzie suddenly widens her eyes and lets out a small gasp of surprise as she realizes something important. She turns around and dashes back inside, leaving Juhwan confused as he asks if she's already tired of watching Lizzie zooms through the cabin door to grab something, while little Dorothy follows her curiously, running right behind her. Juhwan is left alone in the yard with his little flame flickering, grumbling that it took a whole lot of effort to pull that off right after. He shakes his fingers in confusion and starts wondering how on earth he's supposed to put that flame out, not knowing what to do. He simply gives up and decides he'll just keep the flame burning on his finger until it goes out by itself. The moment he gives up and relaxes his mind, the little flame suddenly vanishes into thin air, leaving the young man confused. Walking away thoughtfully, he reflects that magic in this world is weird and that he still hasn't figured out how it actually works. With these thoughts in mind, the Prota finally decides to head inside the cabin to join his family. Upon entering, he finds Dorothy staring very intently into the wooden supply bucket. The little girl turns around with a very sad face and whines, downcast, that the amount of meat in there is way too small. Juhwan looks at her with an understanding gaze, realizing that the girl is genuinely bummed out simply because the meat portion shrank. He takes a firm stance and swears to himself that he will bring rabbit meat home today without fail to cheer up his daughter. Outside the house, the voice of the old hunter Gus calls out for Juhwan, asking if he's ready to head out. Gus is standing in the yard leaning on his wooden staff, and Juhwan nods, confirming that he's ready for their meetup. Juhwan grabs his hunting gear off the table and lets his family know he is officially taking off. Dorothy runs up to him happily and wishes her daddy a safe hunting trip, to which Juhwan responds warmly. He pats the little girl's head, praising her for being a good girl, making the little one nod with a beaming smile from ear to ear. Lizzie affectionately asks him to be careful in the forest, and Juhwan returns the sentiment, telling her to stay safe at the cabin too. In a sweet moment, he pulls Lizzie in for a loving goodbye kiss, leaving little Dorothy surprised as she watches the scene. Jealous and with a funny little pout, the girl closes her eyes and demands a goodbye kiss from her dad too. Juhwan chuckles and kneels down in front of her, agreeing to give Dorothy a kiss on the cheek too while Lizzie watches amused. He gives her a gentle kiss on her cheek, making the little girl burst into a super happy and excited laugh. Suddenly, he sniffs the air and asks if he smells meat on her breath, accusing her of sneaking food, which she gleefully confirms. As they leave the house, the two hunters head straight toward Gus's traps, while the old man continues giving his lessons along the way. Gus walks along, pointing at the trees on their path, asking the young man if they could be used as good firewood. And at other times, the old hunter would make him stop in the middle of the dirt road to search for and examine rabbit droppings. Suddenly, Gus whispers, telling Juhwan to stop walking immediately, putting the young man on high alert in the middle of the woods. The seasoned hunter calmly points his finger towards some bushes further ahead, warning that there is something right over there. Juhwan looks closely in the indicated direction, surprised by what he sees before him in the forest. The animal is a rabbit, but Juhwan is confused because the creature is two-legged and muscular, completely different from normal rabbits. He thinks that, since this is a different world, that beast looks more like a rabbit that bizarrely evolved from a kangaroo. The creature bared its sharp teeth and let out an aggressive, menacing roar in their direction. Gus comments that since the animal is full of energy, it wasn't caught long ago, making it the perfect prey for a first hunt. But the old man warns that it won't be easy at all, explaining that taking down a beast that fights back is a completely different ballgame. He says it's nothing like hunting defenseless game and confesses that the feeling of his very first hunt remains fresh in his memory. Right after, the old hunter tells Ju-wan to grab the arrow he gave him, and the prota nods in confirmation. The old man praises Ju-wan for being sharp, commenting that he hasn't been in the mountains long, but has already picked up a lot of words. Gus turns to him solemnly and declares that this first hunt belongs entirely to the young man. The old man states seriously that he will teach him exactly how brutal hunting can be, and that he will never forget this day. Following instructions, the prota takes firm steps to get a bit closer to the trapped target. Gus orders him to shoot the creature's foot first to practice his aim on a moving target, taking Ju-wan by surprise. He explains that the young man needs to start with the animal standing still, and then aim at it while it thrashes around in pain from the wound. Gus warns that the mountain is fair and shows no favor to humans, and that if they hunt with cruelty, one day the beast will have the upper hand. The old man concludes by saying that if the young man wants to return home alive, he must never forget the lesson he learns today. Ju-wan pulls back the bowstring, aiming at the monster rabbit's paw, thinking that doing so won't take it down but will only inflict useless pain. Sweating nervously, the young man focuses his aim, unable to understand the real reason why the old hunter is putting him through this. Gus shouts impatiently, demanding that he shoot the beast's foot first, only to aim and hit its head afterward. The bipedal beast glares at the hunter with its glowing yellow eyes, making a bizarre noise that almost sounds like a snicker. Looking at the target, Ju-wan thinks that, for some mysterious reason, that scene reminds him of when he first woke up in this world. He remembers his skinny, weakened body from the past, locked in a cage surrounded by endlessly decaying remains. A second later, the arrow is released and strikes the monster's paw dead on, making the rabbit shriek in agony from the impact. The young man lowers his bow and comments to himself, slightly surprised that he actually managed to hit the target. Without any hesitation, Gus shouts for him to do it again, leaving Ju-wan incredulous as he asks if he really wants another shot. The old man orders him to aim for the front paws this time, and Ju-wan knocks another arrow. Knowing the hunter must view this process as necessary, he locks his gaze on the agonizing beast and decides that, before feeling pity for the creature, he needs to prioritize Lizzie and Dorothy's survival. Ju-wan decides to just tune out the animal's cries of pain and focus on the shot, reminding himself that those are just the typical noises of prey. He releases the bowstring, sending the arrow flying through the air at high speed, focused entirely on protecting and supporting his family. The shot travels straight and true, heading precisely for the monster creature's glowing yellow eye. The prota reflects that, to keep them safe, it doesn't matter if he has to turn into a monster or a cold-blooded operator. Later in the forest clearing, he laments having intentionally caused pain to the creature. Even though he could have ended its life right then and there, Ju-wan sits on the grass lost in thought while Gus packs the hunted rabbit into a sack, knowing that survival hunting is far from romantic. Looking down at his own hands, he concludes that it's all just a matter of survival, but vows never to forget what he did today. Gus lifts the sack of rabbits and tells Ju-wan to take all the captured animals home, surprising the young man with his generosity. The old man gives a satisfied smile and nods, and the young man thanks him immensely for the help and guidance. Old Gus leans on his staff and announces that they should now head out to grab the last remaining rabbit. While Ju-wan picks up the heavy sack, Ju-wan casts a curious glance out of the corner of his eye at the bag in his arms, where the last monster rabbit is carefully stowed away, walking down the trail. The young man notes that that specimen looked completely different from the previous ones, and Gus tells him to hurry up and catch it. However, the prota suddenly stops mid-stride, holds the bag tightly, and asks the hunter to wait a second. He suggests that, instead of taking its life, they could raise it alive at home to have emergency supplies in case they run out of game in the future, crossing his arms in a no gesture. He explains in his simple language that he doesn't want to kill the rabbit, but rather take it home alive with them. Gus falls silent for a moment, and soon lets out a quiet chuckle at the young man's unusual idea. The old man willingly agrees to the suggestion, and gives permission to go ahead with the plan, making Ju-wan very happy. He hands the sack back and urges the young man to capture the beast without taking its life, which Ju-wan promptly confirms. The two of them then resume their walk down the forest trail to embark on the day's new and unusual hunt. Moving stealthily with quiet footsteps, the young man begins sneaking through the trees with the sack in hand. He spots the muscular rabbit from behind, completely distracted and oblivious to the silent approach of its hunter. Meanwhile, smoke rises gently from the chimney of the mountain cabin, showing that their home is in complete peace. Ju-wan reflects that back on Earth, he never had any hope of building his own family or finding a real purpose in life. Gus carefully carves a piece of wood, while Ju-wan thinks to himself that he finally has the family he always wished for. For the first time in his life, the young man feels like he has a genuine reason to live and work hard every single day. Suddenly, he spots a small wooden box sitting on the workshop table, becoming quite curious about the object. He notices that the wooden tablets stored in the box have carvings that closely resemble the written script used in this fantasy world. Juwon enthusiastically picks up one of the tablets and realizes that if an object like this is here, this might be his big chance. He tries to speak to Gus in his simple way, asking the old man to teach him how to read those tablets, catching the hunter off guard. Gus asks in disbelief if he really wants to learn that, and Juwon confirms with strong conviction that he wants to learn very much. Scratching his head thoughtfully, the old hunter accepts the request and gets ready to look for something else to assist with the task. He walks over to a wooden chest in the corner of the room to search for the materials needed for the young man's first lesson. While rummaging through the chest, Gus comments to himself that, in that case, Juwon will also need a few other writing supplies. Gus reaches out, handing a stack of wooden tablets to Juwon, who excitedly begs him to start teaching right away. The old man instructs the youth to follow him to the table, and Juwon immediately agrees, thrilled by the opportunity to learn. With deep focus, the proto begins practicing writing using a quill and black ink on a piece of paper. Gus observes him silently with crossed arms, thinking he is a very peculiar man, and wondering what he will use. Reading for the old man remembers that he never expected to use those writing tablets again, which he had bought in the past in case he gained military merit. He bitterly recalls how long it took him to learn to read and thinks that if he had known things would end up like this, he wouldn't have even bothered shaking his head. Gus decides to brush those sad memories out of his mind, repeating to himself that all of that is in the past. Now he thinks it is high time to start patrolling the mountains, searching for traces of goblins, knowing he will need to head much deeper. The old man knows that just as animals enter their mating season in the spring, goblin activity also surges during this time. He acknowledges that despite being inexperienced, Juwon picks things up very quickly, and if he works with seasoned adventurers, he'll manage just fine. Feeling a pang of pain in his limping leg, Gus somberly predicts that it won't be long before he encounters those cursed goblins. With a deeply grim glare full of hatred, he swears to himself that he will take down every last one of those terrible monsters. Meanwhile, the peaceful mountain cabin remains in total quiet under the soft glow of the late afternoon. Inside the house, Lizzie cuts a piece of new fabric and confirms she will make an outfit for Dorothy. Leaving the little girl eager to know when it will be ready, Lizzie lets out a warm laugh and asks if her daughter knows how many times she has asked that same question, to which Dorothy giggles and says she doesn't know. Suddenly, a sound at the door startles Lizzie, who quickly turns around calling out her husband's name to see if it's him coming home. Juwon steps into the cabin with a warm smile, and little Dorothy runs over happily with open arms to hug her dad. He picks her up lovingly, while the little girl radiantly celebrates, showing off the new clothes Lizzie is making for her right after. He sets the hunting sack on the floor, and the girl notices that the fabric starts shaking on its own, making a confusing sound. The sack thrashes wildly against the wooden floor, leaving little Dorothy extremely intrigued and amazed to see it move. Like that, Dorothy asks with intense curiosity if that's some kind of magic sack, and Juwon offers a gentle smile, reassuring her that it isn't sorcery. Juwon says he'll show her and starts untying the knot with one hand while holding her, leaving Lizzie amazed by his strength. Seeing her husband struggle a bit, Lizzie quickly kneels down and reaches out to help him untie the knot on the heavy sack. The moment the knot is undone, two long, furry ears pop out of the opening, startling everyone in the room. The little girl jumps in surprise in her father's arms and points enthusiastically upon seeing that the creature inside actually moved. She hops down from his arms and dashes excitedly toward the sack, cheering happily as she recognizes that it's a rabbit. Worried, Lizzie steps in front of the girl and asks her to wait, letting her know that she will pull the animal out of the bag safely herself with great care and gentleness. She reaches her hands into the bag and begins pulling the small, furry rabbit out. However, Lizzie gets startled and ends up falling backward onto the floor when the cute little white bunny with a horn on its head hops out. Dorothy covers her mouth in total surprise and stammers that the little bunny is actually super strange. She points knowingly toward the animal's little head, noticing a very unusual feature right between its fluffy ears. The small white bunny just sits there looking confused, while Dorothy squeals in wonder seeing that it has a horn. The little girl thinks the creature is super cute, but Lizzie quickly cautions her not to get any closer to the mysterious animal. She gets into a defensive stance and explains that because it has horns, the bunny might actually turn out to be very dangerous. Lizzie takes cautious steps forward and promises her daughter that she will capture the little creature safely for them. Straining herself and making a slight face, she lunges forward with open arms to scoop up the small intruder. Lizzie is stunned to realize that she managed to hold the bunny in her hands with extreme ease and zero resistance. She comments in confusion that, for a wild rabbit, it makes no sense for it to be captured so effortlessly. Suddenly, while holding the cute little animal, Lizzie notices something unusual on the rabbit's body and asks for a moment. She sees that the little bunny is trembling with fear and discovers that it is injured. With a visible mark on its cute little body, Dorothy asks with deep concern if the little bunny is hurt, and Lizzie sympathetically confirms that the poor thing really is in a lot of pain. The little girl turns around with teary eyes and calls for her dad to help, taking Juwon by surprise with the news. The young man quickly approaches Lizzie and asks her to hand the bunny over to him, saying he'll try to handle the situation. Carefully, she passes the trembling little creature into her husband's arms, hoping he can do something. Juwon cradles the injured bunny very gently in his massive hands, looking down at the creature thoughtfully. Next, he activates his healing magic, enveloping the small rabbit's body in a warm golden light. Dorothy watches everything up close and exclaims joyfully that the little bunny isn't feeling any pain anymore. With eyes shining in pure admiration, the little girl jumps for joy and shouts that her daddy is simply amazing. Juwon clears his throat bashfully, but pleased with the compliment, while Dorothy clings to his leg with affection and Lizzie laughs in amusement. When the young man bends down to place the fully healed rabbit on the floor, Dorothy hastily calls out to him, asking him to wait a second. She dashes off and quickly returns holding a small wicker basket in her hands. Shouting enthusiastically for her dad to look at what she brought, Juwon finds the girl's enthusiasm endearing and places the small horned bunny very carefully inside the basket she is holding. The bunny soon curls up and falls comfortably asleep inside, making Dorothy whisper in wonder that the little creature is already sleeping. Juwon asks her to protect the rabbit well from then on, but the little girl gets a bit confused. Not fully catching what he said, Lizzie kindly explains that Daddy wants her to take good care of the little baby animal, leaving the girl surprised as she asks if he means her. With a radiant smile, little Dorothy happily accepts the mission and promises she will take great care of her new horned buddy. As the couple sits on the floor to rest, Dorothy speaks softly to the bunny in the basket, reassuring it that she will protect it from everything. Seeing such a sweet and innocent scene, Juwon and Lizzie exchange affectionate glances, smiling brightly with relief. Night finally falls over the forest, bringing a comforting silence to Juwon's mountain cabin. Dorothy falls sound asleep in her little bed, keeping the rabbit basket right beside her pillow, and muttering a few words. Juwon listens to his daughter's sleep talk and silently reflects that humans are greedy because even when they have enough, they always want more. He recalls that before, he only wanted to escape the slave carriage, but now that they have a home, he already wants to expand it so Dorothy can have more space. Lizzie teaches Juwon how to pronounce words, while the young man reflects that now that he has a family, he feels the urge to learn to read and write. He gazes at her with deep affection as she speaks, thinking to himself that the person he is most grateful for in his entire life is Lizzie. He notices she must be exhausted after spending the whole day working without pause, wanting nothing more than to rest a bit in the room. Juwon then steps up from behind and gently places his hands on his beloved wife's tired shoulders. Lizzie gets a little startled by the sudden touch, but soon smiles and whispers a thank you as he begins softly massaging her shoulders. With flushed cheeks, she relaxes into the soothing moment, feeling how warm and full of genuine affection his touch is. The young man continues the slow and gentle massage, running his fingers lovingly across the soft skin of her shoulders. Then, he slowly slides his hands down until he tenderly holds Lizzie's hands, which are resting on her lap. Juwon wraps her in a very warm and affectionate back hug, making Lizzie's heart race and her cheeks turn red with embarrassment. Under the dim, soft glow of a candle on the table, the couple enjoys a moment of pure intimacy and romance in the quiet night. The candle flame is finally blown out softly, leaving the room in a cozy darkness so they can rest. Meanwhile, the following day, carriages travel along a forest road toward the big city where the information broker is located. The village chief inwardly complains about the discomfort of the trip and the high costs, but consoles himself knowing that in the end, it will all be worth it. He reflects thoughtfully that the vast majority of known healing mages are small and physically weak. However, he knows that low-life mountain guardian is different, for he has never seen anyone as massive and strong as Juwon in his whole life. With a nasty smile on his face, he thinks with satisfaction that he will easily make a fortune in gold coins with that valuable piece of info. The other passengers comment on the need to summon a hero, and the chief replies that their country has also tried doing that several times. He mentions rumors that the temple has already summoned a hero, while the others debate whether the enemy nation's hero is a fraud or if heroes even exist. One man doubts the centuries-old legend and comments that since people say the hero looks different, if he's an imposter, they'll find out soon enough. The village chief grows serious as he remembers that, because he lived in isolation, he had forgotten that the region sits extremely close to the enemy nation. He decides he needs to hurry up, sell the information, take the money, and get out of there, because you never know when the enemy might invade. Back at the cabin, little Dorothy plays with the horned bunny while giggling, urging it to wake up and play with her already. Lizzie steps into the room unexpectedly and jokes that the little animal isn't meant for eating. Leaving her daughter thoroughly confused, Dorothy smirks and teasingly replies that even she knows very well that nobody eats baby bunnies. Lizzie chuckles while wiping Dorothy's cheek and says that if she knows that, she should stop drooling from hunger, reminding the little girl about the bunny's food. She gets adorably startled and dashes out of the room super excited, shouting to her mom that she's going to feed the new rabbits right now. Upon stepping out into the yard, the girl finds it odd and wonders why her dad is building a wooden fence if they already have a house. But the very next second, her little golden eyes open wide in surprise as the reason suddenly dawns on her. Dorothy laughs and says she only came outside to feed her beloved bunnies. She observes one of the animals up close and softly comments that it really is quite big and ugly. Dorothy offers a handful of crisp, fresh green leaves to the little creature and tells it to eat it all up. She explains that she's very busy today, so she asks them to eat on their own and behave themselves. Suddenly, the little girl gets startled upon noticing that the amount of leaves in her hands randomly increased out of nowhere. Overjoyed, she says that she knows how to use magic too, and that she needs to show this new trick to her dad. As soon as he gets back, Dorothy quickly begins to wonder if she could use her magic on wolf meat to make her whole family super happy. Bursting with excitement, she tosses the leaves to the rabbits and cheers enthusiastically. Meanwhile, inside the cabin, Lizzie holds the wolf pelt and thinks anxiously that the merchant's carriage will soon arrive at the village. She knows the merchant would love that pelt, but hesitates to sell it since it was Juwan's first catch, even though they desperately need money. Lizzie hugs the pelt affectionately, thinking about all the essential items they need to buy, like new clothes and shoes for Juwan. Looking down at a rabbit pelt stretched on the floor, she sighs upon realizing that that alone won't be enough for the purchases. Faced with this tough financial situation, Lizzie makes a major decision, a look of firm resolve settling in her eyes. With deep determination, she gathers all of her long, light brown hair and holds it firmly behind her head. Then, with her free hand, Lizzie picks up a pair of sharp metal scissors that were nearby. Suddenly, Juwan's voice echoes from outside the cabin, announcing that he has finally returned home. Dorothy runs joyfully into her father's arms, shouting his name, and Juwan receives her with a warm embrace. Lizzie approaches slowly with a gentle smile and welcomes her beloved husband back. Juwan stares at her in shock and utters Lizzie's name, while Dorothy excitedly asks if her dad noticed it too. The little girl points in surprise and says that all of her mom's beautiful hair simply vanished. Now I'm sad. I really liked her with long hair. Juwan looks at his wife with a deeply concerned expression and calls her name softly, not quite knowing what to say. Dorothy runs around asking where her hair went, and Lizzie calmly answers that she just decided to cut it. The girl pouts and questions why she did that, saying her long hair was wonderful. Juwan quickly suspects the real reason and says with a heavy heart that he feels terrible that she had to make such a sacrifice. He takes a step forward, approaches her tenderly, and calls her name with extreme gentleness. Juwan softly strokes her short hair and offers a sincere apology, leaving Lizzie completely caught off guard by his reaction. Lizzie gazes at him up close with glistening eyes, thinking to herself that he truly is a very special man. She reflects that most women in that region only let their hair grow for the sole purpose of selling it to survive. But Juwan's tender words and empathy are so sweet that for some reason, Lizzie feels tears welling up in her eyes. She pulls him into a tight embrace, weeping with emotion and revealing that she isn't sad, but rather overwhelmingly happy because of his care. Dorothy watches her parents hug with a massive smile on her face, feeling immense joy and a truly warm heart. Out in the yard, the little girl asks her mom to climb into the basket too, but Lizzie declines, saying she would be way too heavy for her husband. Juwan easily stands up carrying his daughter on his back, leaving little Dorothy thrilled with the height of the ride. Dorothy shouts excitedly for them to get moving, and the lovely family happily starts walking toward the neighboring village upon reaching the village. They encounter bustling streets packed with people walking back and forth. Dorothy skips ahead energetically, cheerfully mentioning that she smells a delicious aroma in the air. Juwan looks around and wonders how long it's been since he walked down such a crowded street, remembering his past life before reincarnating. He continues watching the people rushing past, paying close attention to every local villager. At that moment, a mysterious man wearing a dark blue cloak walks past them, catching Juwan's attention for a second. The commotion on the street vividly reminds the prota of what his old life on Earth was like during the holiday season. He melancholically recalls walking completely alone through the noisy crowds on those cold days. But now everything has changed, as he has a wonderful wife by his side and an incredibly excited daughter joining the outing. He smiles happily, feeling how wonderful it is to go on a family walk, while Dorothy gasps in surprise at what she sees. Without wasting a second, the little girl dashes off in total excitement toward the local market stalls. Dorothy points at the pots for sale at a stall and happily announces that she really wants to take a closer look at those objects. The merchant shouts loudly to attract customers, inviting everyone to come closer and promising to pay top dollar for goods. Dorothy stands completely mesmerized by everything around her, letting out a breath of pure wonder. Suddenly, a blonde boy with blue eyes and fancy clothes appears before her, leaving Dorothy quite surprised. Dorothy points at him and comments that the boy looks a lot like the ugly rabbit, leaving the kid thoroughly confused by her remark. Lizzie asks her husband to keep an eye on their daughter, while Juwan observes the boy with interest, wondering if the kid really resembles him. Lizzie gently places her cut hair and the rabbit pelt on the merchant's counter. The merchant inspects the items with a suspicious look, while the couple waits silently for the assessment. He claims he received many similar pelts recently and that the price dropped, leaving Lizzie quite surprised and disappointed. The man notices that the pelt is in excellent condition and very soft, but thinks to himself that he can't let Lizzie find out the truth. He asserts that he can only trade those for cheap goods, thinking with satisfaction that she is falling right for his trap. While planning to hand over worthless items in exchange, the merchant is startled by an intimidating presence behind him. He turns to see Juwan exuding a terrifying aura and thinks in a panic that he has never seen such a massive giant in his life. Juwan simply stares down at the merchant in complete silence, creating an extremely tense atmosphere around the stall. Without saying a single word, the prota reaches out and quickly snatches back Lizzie's hair and the rabbit pelt. The merchant grumbles in fear, wondering where all that raw physical strength comes from as he looks at the man's size. Juwan tells his wife that they are heading to another town. As he could tell by the merchant's eyes that he was blatantly lying, Lizzie expresses concern that the next town is very far away, but Juwan reassures her, saying they will get there in no time. The merchant thinks bitterly that the giant isn't just strong, but was also sharp enough to cut off any chance of haggling. Juwan explains that the rabbit pelt was top quality and that the man lied, leaving Lizzie deep in thought over the revelation. The vendor tries to defend himself, shouting that he didn't lie, but Lizzie realizes he tried to take advantage of her naivety to pay dirt cheap. Desperate not to lose the deal, the merchant offers to take a loss, throwing in salt, a pot, and even free men's clothing. Seeing the man's sudden shift in attitude, Lizzie looks at him with suspicion, wondering why he's doing that all of a sudden. She then takes Juwan's hand and says they should leave to find a place that will pay a fair price, and he agrees right away. Juwan offers to carry his wife due to the long distance, but Lizzie laughs cutely, replying that she can walk perfectly fine on her own. The merchant watches the couple walk away, deeply regretting losing out on one of the finest items to show up that day. He still attempts to shout, asking them to wait a bit longer, but the two keep walking without looking back. The man is left utterly speechless, admitting to himself that he completely ruined everything out of pure greed. While the merchant cries over his mistake at his stall, Juwan and Lizzie walk away happily. Holding hands through the village, Dorothy proudly brags in front of the other children, stating that Juwan is her dad, until she gets called over to leave. She skips happily after the couple, shouting once more at the top of her lungs that the strong man is her daddy. Later on, Dorothy sleeps peacefully, feeling safe and protected, knowing that her super strong dad will always take care of her. She snuggles in further, finding it curious how nice and warm it is, given that just a short while ago she was feeling quite cold. Suddenly, the little girl remembers that she is actually comfortably tucked inside her father's large coat. Dorothy pokes her little head out of the coat and suddenly remembers her beloved bunnies that were left back at the cabin. She urgently asks her dad to set her down on the ground, as she needs to go feed her pets right away. Juwan fulfills her request and sets her down carefully on the grass. While she immediately gets ready to dash off super excited, she runs toward the wooden fence, shouting happily to the rabbits that she is finally back. The little girl quickly grabs a good handful of green leaves to serve as a delicious meal for them. She approaches the small enclosure with the leaves in her hands, happily announcing that she brought fresh food for the animals. But the very next second, her little golden eyes open wide in pure panic and disbelief. Dorothy realizes in absolute shock that the wooden pen is completely empty and that the rabbit has vanished. Unable to hold back, the little girl begins crying hysterically while still clutching the green leaves in her hands. Lizzie runs toward her, deeply concerned, asking what happened, and the girl tries to explain between sobs that the bunny is gone. Seeing her daughter's desperation as she begs for the animal to return, Lizzie feels heartbroken, not knowing how to comfort her. Hearing the shouting and crying coming from the yard, Juhuan quickly steps out of the cabin to see what's going on out there. Lizzie informs him that the rabbit ran away, and Juhuan kneels down, asking tenderly if that's the reason little Dorothy is crying. However, the prota gets startled upon noticing that Lizzie is also crying over the escape of the animal he worked so hard to hunt. Juhuan feels quite confused by all the commotion, wondering if they are really crying that much just over a rabbit. Meanwhile, in the middle of the dark forest, a terrifying goblin with glowing red eyes lets out a menacing roar. Hidden, the experienced hunter. Gus observes the monster and knows that attacking them alone right now would be foolish and result in his own demise. He thinks the enemy camp is overcrowded and that when food runs short, the creatures will start turning on each other and fighting to the death. Still, Gus knows that if a single goblin loses control and attacks the village, the entire horde will do the same in the blink of an eye. He reflects that when isolated, these monsters are not dangerous and are actually quite weak compared to other beasts. The real threat lies in the fact that they always fight in large packs and reproduce as fast as rabbits, never diminishing in number. Gus sorrowfully recalls how these creatures capture women to force reproduction, leaving the victims in indescribable misery. Gus knows that as soon as spring arrives, the goblins' breeding instincts will take over, so they need to eliminate the monsters before that happens. He treks through the forest with difficulty, thinking that to successfully defeat the monster horde, he will need the help of that giant. Gus feels his conscience weigh heavily as he remembers how Juwan is always genuinely grateful whenever he teaches him something, but he sees no other choice. The old hunter pushes forward, knowing Juwan is the only person strong enough to successfully wipe out all those goblins. The following morning, Lizzie wakes up feeling refreshed and lets out a long yawn as she steps out of the bedroom in the mountain cabin. She walks through the room and finds it strange to see her husband's back so early at the entrance of the house. Calling out Juwan's name in curiosity, Lizzie decides to step into the yard to see what he's up to and calls out to him again in a very loving manner. She gets a fright upon coming across two massive rabbits hanging by the doorway, while Juwan turns around surprised and asks if she's awake already. Lizzie asks in admiration if he hunted more rabbits today, and Juwan answers awkwardly, trying to cover up the situation. In truth, the prota recalls running frantically through the forest, trying to catch a very feisty rabbit. He remembers tripping hard and falling face first onto the dirt ground, while the bunny hopped away joyfully. To make matters worse, the rabbit stopped a bit further ahead and looked back with a mocking expression, making the prota quite irritated. Juwan thought with frustration that his initial goal was to bring the animal home alive, but realized that would be impossible at that rate. Determined and filled with annoyance, he promised himself that he would catch that rabbit no matter what happened. Juwan started running like crazy through the forest, yelling out loud while trying to corner the small animal by any means necessary. He says it was no big deal and that he caught the rabbits real quick, making Lizzie clap her hands in delight at her husband's skills. Lizzie asks excitedly what the best way to cook the meat would be, suggesting roasting or preserving the rabbits in salt. Juwan suggests salting one of them and mentions he's going to roast the other right now, taking his wife by surprise with the idea of cooking it himself. Lizzie understands that he wants to make a salted roast and agrees with a smile. While Juhuan begins preparing the meat carefully, she joyfully promises she will make a delicious side meal, and Juhuan responds with a smile saying he can't wait to try the food. As he roasts the rabbit over the campfire, Juhuan thinks that the subtle aroma of bamboo will soak into the meat and make the preserved vegetables taste even better. He notices that the campfire flame is starting to die down and wonders if he needs to throw on more firewood. The prota raises his index finger and manages to summon a tiny flame, staring at it thoughtfully and with concern. He grumbles that this fire magic is a pretty pathetic power, looking useful at first, but actually offering little to no practical help. He goes back to rotating the spit, thinking he needs to get the meat golden and tasty before his wife and daughter get too hungry. Suddenly, a very intense, bright burst of fire unexpectedly erupts from the tip of the prota's finger. Juwan gets startled by the sudden explosion of heat that completely engulfs the entire meat spit before him. Desperate, he shakes his hand, begging the fire to stop burning his beloved family's food and not ruin their lunch. He analyzes his finger in confusion and wonders why the magic suddenly worked so well. Suspecting that the activation doesn't originate from his own body, Juwon recalls when he used fire against the giant wolf and realizes that the magic didn't shoot out directly from him, but rather manifested straight on the target itself. He deduces that if the magic applies directly onto the target, that would explain why his body never gets burned, and decides to do a quick test. Juhwan crouches near the fire and points his finger, focusing on visualizing the fire gently wrapping around the meat to cook it thoroughly. He closes his eyes and concentrates his entire attention on visualizing the meat being perfectly browned by the heat without scorching. The Proto opens his eyes in surprise, noticing that his technique worked flawlessly and that the fire started roasting the meat ideal way. He inwardly celebrates finally unlocking the secret to activating and controlling his fire magic. Pleased with the result of his culinary experiment, Juwon can hardly believe he managed to prepare such a fine roast on a spit. The meat looks incredible on the stone plate, giving off a mouth-watering aroma that makes everyone's mouth water at the table. Lizzie finds the name of the dish her husband made unfamiliar, while Dorothy cheers excitedly, shouting that she finally gets to eat meat. With his hands, Juhwan begins tearing off juicy pieces of the roasted meat that is still steaming hot. He reaches out with a smile and offers the best cuts for his wife and the little girl to try first. Without hesitating, both of them grab the pieces of meat and take a generous bite at the exact same time. Lizzie closes her eyes, savoring the meal, while Dorothy exclaims with sparkling eyes that the food is absolutely delicious. Juwon feels his heart warm seeing their joy and realizes that simply watching his family eat happily leaves him completely fulfilled. The couple chats merrily while eating lunch, and Juwon reflects that after getting the hang of it, using his fire magic became much easier. Later in the forest, he practices firing bursts of flame at targets located about half a meter away from his hand. Upon seeing the rock completely scorched, Juwon thinks with a shudder that this power could become extremely dangerous if used against living beings. He looks at his own hands, knowing that with healing and fire magic, he will be capable of protecting Lizzie and Dorothy against any future threat. Juwon wonders if the Santa Claus of his past life gave him these powers precisely so he could defend his family and live in peace. He smirks, thinking he should set up an altar with a nice food offering once Christmas finally rolls around in this realm. Suddenly, a voice coming from the direction of the cabin shouts out loud, announcing that the other bunny has finally woken up. Dorothy runs through the house super excited, carrying the horned bunny in her basket, promising to show her new friend every corner of their home. She stops in front of the stone fireplace and proudly explains that that is the kitchen, the special place where they prepare all their meals. Dorothy joyfully emphasizes that the kitchen is an extremely important place in the house, and the little creature seems to listen intently to everything. Next, she points toward one of the wooden corners and innocently explains to the confused bunny that that is a wall. The little girl walks a bit further and lets the small animal know that she is going to introduce him to a very important person in the family. She shows Lizzie to the rabbit and says that that is her mother, warning the little creature never to forget her face. Right then, Juwon opens the door and steps into the cabin, immediately spotted by Dorothy, who shouts happily upon seeing her dad. Dorothy asks the bunny to say hello to her dad, and Juwon stoops down with a smile to give a sweet greeting to the small animal. Innocently, Dorothy tells her dad that the horned bunny's name is now Tosuni, leaving the Proto quite confused. Juwon asks what she means by that, and Lizzie watches the scene from afar. A bit surprised by the choice of name for the animal, Lizzie stays silent for a moment, a thoughtful and slightly concerned expression on her face as she looks at her husband. Lizzie begins talking about Dorothy in a serious manner, and Juwon reacts in complete shock as he realizes what his wife is about to reveal to him. The Proto stares at his wife in disbelief, thinking about how small and delicate her body is to carry such a massive revelation. Suddenly, Juwon's legs give out and he drops to his knees on the wooden floor of the house. Completely drained of strength, Juwon softly touches Lizzie's belly, thinking emotionally that there is a baby in there, while she looks at him confused by his reaction. I'm so happy for the protagonist. This family is so wholesome. Lizzie turns bright red with embarrassment and widens her eyes as she realizes the absurd misunderstanding her husband just made. She frantically denies it, saying there is no baby at all and that that word is forbidden in the house, leaving Juwon completely baffled. Juwon sighs in relief and thinks that it really is too early to have another child, believing it's better to wait until they are more settled. Dorothy approaches with the bunny in her basket and asks curiously why her dad is kneeling on the floor like that. He smiles, thinking he needs to focus first on strengthening his bond with Dorothy, giving her all the love the little girl missed out on before Dorothy lets out a lovely laugh and says her dad looks just like the bunny Tosuni with that funny face. Ju-won observes the small rabbit and notices that its horn seems to have grown, remembering that this world has magic and strange monsters. However, as he gazes closely at the small animal, he senses that that horned bunny really has something very unusual about it. He seriously questions whether it is truly safe to keeping that mysterious creature inside his house with his family. The proto reflects that he gave a lot of thought to whether he should kick the bunny out or at least keep it outside in a bamboo pen. However, since Lizzie and Dorothy had already grown very attached to the animal over the past few days and protested against the idea, Ju-won ultimately gave in. After all, aside from having a small horn on its head, the creature behaves just like a regular, very gentle rabbit. He thinks that if old Gus were there, he could ask him about the animal. Remembering that it has been 5 days since his last visit, Ju-won worries about Gus's age and injured leg, thinking that as soon as he can fully trust him, he will reveal his healing magic. He looks down at his own hand and plans to use his power to permanently cure the seasoned hunter's injured leg. The proto wants to repay all the help and guidance he received from Gus, feeling immense gratitude toward the old friend he knows that in this new world where he and his wife have no other relatives, the old hunter has become someone essential. Ju-won thinks warmly that Gus could be like a grandfather to Dorothy and a true father figure to his beloved Lizzie. He sits in the yard in front of some logs and reflects that, since mages are rare around there, using magic conspicuously would be far too dangerous. Ju-won decides he needs to train to keep the fire burning internally, managing to use the power in daily life without anyone noticing to start training. He closes his eyes and visualizes his core glowing intensely red, as if it were molten lava. He extends his hand and concentrates to the maximum, trying to channel all the accumulated magic energy subtly and quietly. The proto slowly opens his eyes with a doubtful look and wonders if his effort actually yielded any results. Seeing the wooden logs untouched, he questions if the heat generated was too weak or if he messed up the visualization of the flow. Ju-won lets out his breath slowly with a discouraged sigh, admitting to himself that he still needs a lot of practice to master the technique. But suddenly, he gets a huge shock as he sees all the wooden logs burst into fierce flames all at once. Panicking from the sudden fire, the proto rushes frantically to grab a wooden bucket full of water that was nearby. Without wasting a single second, he throws all the water from the bucket onto the burning logs to put out the fire quickly. He analyzes the ruined logs and realizes happily that his test didn't fail, for the wood was burning from the inside out. He celebrates the perfect success of his training, but gets interrupted by Dorothy's joyful shout calling for him from the yard. The little girl runs excitedly in his direction, calling him to come eat right away. As the delicious rabbit meat is already done, she takes a joyful leap and throws herself right into Ju-won's arms, who receives her with a massive smile on his face. Ju-won tenderly tells her not to jump so high because it's dangerous, and the girl laughs, excitedly replying that she wants to eat right now. He agrees and carries her in his arms toward the cabin to have lunch, while the girl super happily celebrates that she's going to eat rabbit meat. But suddenly, Ju-won freezes mid-step in the yard upon hearing a scream of terror coming directly from the middle of the mountain forest. Ju-won keeps holding his daughter in his arms and looks up intently, trying to figure out the source of that strange noise. He observes a flock of birds circling above the mountains and finds that scene extremely unusual. Ju-won reflects anxiously that he has never seen birds acting like that since he arrived there, but soon tries to brush away the bad thoughts. Dorothy tugs at his clothes and lets him know crossly that the rabbit meat is getting cold, making the proto apologize for getting distracted. He agrees and says they are going to eat the roast right away, making the little girl super excited to start the meal. A short while later, old Gus appears in front of the cabin gate and calls Ju-won to step outside to talk. Ju-won opens the door confused and wonders what is going on. Since the old hunter usually only visits them at dawn, Gus notices the new bamboo fence, and Ju-won explains that he built it because mountain wolves and strange people are very dangerous. The proto asks the reason for the visit at that hour, and Gus reveals that he came to teach him how to craft a real hunting bow. The hunter explains that he will teach how to make a toy first before moving on to a real bow, and Ju-won readily agrees. Gus warns that they don't have much time to waste and asks him to follow along, leaving the proto a bit confused yet obedient. The two walk over to a pile of wooden logs located beside the mountain cabin to begin the work. Holding a small hatchet, Gus positions himself in front of one of the logs and asks the proto to pay close attention to every movement. With great skill, he begins landing firm and precise strikes using the hatchet to initiate the cut on the wood. Gus pauses the cutting to show a small wooden wedge to the prota, explaining that it is the first item to be prepared. Next, he positions the wedge into the crack of the log and begins striking it hard, using a heavy hammer to split the wood open. The experienced hunter advises against driving the wedge in too fast, teaching him to do the process step by step with patience. Juwon watches the log split and understands that the technique consists of using multiple wedges to crack the wood gradually. Time passes quietly on the mountain while the two continue working together outside the cabin. Gus asks him to observe and memorize everything, but Juhwan senses that there is something very odd about his friend's sudden rush. The prota notices that the hunter is rushing the entire learning process all at once, thinking worryingly that he seems to be in a big hurry. Intrigued, Juwon asks if something bad is happening or if the mountain has become dangerous due to wild wolves. Juwon points upward, talking about the birds flying in circles, but Gus tries to change the subject, saying it must just be a wolf attack. Unwilling to offer more details, Gus reaches out and hands over a finished arrow so the prota can use it for his training. The hunter tells him to head back inside and promises to teach him more later, and Juwon bows out of respect. Thanking him for the help, Juwon begins walking back toward his cabin holding the arrow, while Gus watches him walk away in total silence. Gus remains alone in the yard, a deeply intent and serious look on his face, revealing that he conceals very dark secrets. He remembers when he went to the village a few days ago to report to the chief that he had found traces of goblins in the region. The hunter recalls that the chief acted fast and sent his own son to seek help in a town located half a day's journey away. In that big city, there is an important branch of the Adventurers Guild, the very same place where carriages usually make stops. Gus knows that even though it's a small branch, they would act quickly to dispatch capable adventurers as soon as they were notified. He plans for the adventurers' arrival in a few days, but knows he can't take it easy, as those monsters attack very fast. Gus deduces that the birds Juwon saw flying in the forest were actually carrion crows searching for human remains. He suspects the exact location where the deaths took place, remembering a group of people who lived hidden near the village. The hunter mournfully deduces that one of the women who lived around there ended up drawing the goblin's attention during her wanderings. He knows the village will be the next target, and that as soon as the monster's rage explodes, the entire mountain region will suffer the consequences. Relentlessly, Gus thinks to himself that every grand goal requires some inevitable sacrifices along the way. However, when thinking of Juhwan, the hunter knows full well that the young giant has more than enough strength to survive it all. Gus stares coldly at the horizon with his back turned, reflecting darkly on what would happen if the young man's wife ended up dying. He cruel-mindedly thinks that, even with a broken heart from the loss, Juhwan would survive and could simply start life over with someone else. Gus walks down the steps slowly, reflecting that he has finally found the most glorious hunting ground of his long life journey. In the middle of the dark night, a nimble goblin with glowing eyes leaps over the rocks, preparing to act. Back at the cabin, Juwon and Lizzie share playful laughs, while little Dorothy fake cries, throwing a temper tantrum at her parents. The little girl lightly punches her dad's leg, pretending to be mad, and Juwon finds the scene adorable, thinking he can always hunt another bunny for her. Juwon laughs out loud, feeling extremely happy to be able to share such simple moments full of joy and affection with his beautiful family. Meanwhile, Gus holds a massive, heavy metal sword, reflecting on his destiny after living his entire life as a hunter. He grips the handle of the weapon tightly, demonstrating all his resolve and preparation for the impending deadly combat. Hidden in the dark forest behind a large boulder, Gus whispers to himself that the decisive moment has finally arrived. The experienced hunter raises the sword blade, which clearly reflects the image of Juwon and his family happily gathered in the cabin. With a determined and focused look, Gus reveals in his thoughts that he has finally located the goblin's secret lair. He remembers that suffocating, terrible place where people completely lost all their dignity and humanity. Juwon acknowledges that he doesn't know how to hunt or how to survive in that mysterious world, but there is one single thing he is absolutely sure of. He realizes that the experienced Gus is giving his absolute best to train him and prepare him to live as a mountain hunter. Focused on his training goal, the prota takes a deep breath and releases the bowstring to fire the arrow with precision. The arrow travels at high speed, cutting through the wind and grazing past the small rabbit running frightened through the forest. Outside the cabin, the cold wind blows strong, making Lizzie shiver slightly as she opens the wooden door and steps out of the house. She spots her husband's back as he works hard building the bamboo fence to keep the whole family safe. Lizzie approaches slowly through the yard, carrying a warm bowl of soup. Calling her husband's name gently, Juwon turns around, concerned upon seeing her, and comments that it's getting very cold, asking why she stepped out of the cabin, with a warm smile. She reaches out and offers the bowl of hot soup for him to eat, leaving him quite moved. He thanks her and asks her to go back inside because of the cold, but Lizzie insists on staying by his side until he finishes eating. The prota can't hold back a goofy smile, his cheeks flushing slightly as he notices all the affection from his wife sitting near a small campfire. He takes a sip of the hot soup and praises the delicious seasoning. Thanking her from the bottom of his heart, Lizzie smiles radiantly at the compliment, modestly replying that she is extremely glad he enjoyed the food. He observes her in silence for a few moments with a look filled with admiration and profound gratitude for having her in his life. Next, Ju-won steps up from behind and wraps Lizzie in a very cozy and affectionate hug, catching her by surprise. He whispers that he is always so grateful for her, and Lizzie responds with a sweet smile, saying she is the one who should be thankful. Under the soft, warm light of the campfire, the two enjoy a lovely moment of connection and affection in the silence of the night. The next day, Lizzie says she can do the laundry by herself, but Ju-won insists on helping, commenting that the work goes faster together. As he wrings out the wet clothes with strength, he thinks to himself that this chore makes him really appreciate the washing machines back on Earth. He reflects on all the effort of soaking the clothes, rinsing them in clean water, and hanging them on the clothesline before dawn. He watches Lizzie work and feels a pang in his chest, thinking that she had to do all that heavy labor alone until now. Suddenly, little Dorothy comes running happily toward them across the grass, shouting for her beloved parents. She urgently asks her dad to heal the horned bunny, and Ju-won realizes he had completely forgotten to do that. Ju-won finds it strange to see an identical plush toy in the basket, and the girl proudly explains that her mom made the cute toy. The prota nods with a smile and strokes the real little animal, making the girl let out happy giggles of satisfaction. He extends his hand calmly toward the horned bunny to finally concentrate and activate his powerful healing energy. A brilliant golden light completely envelops the small animal's body, while its wound seals and heals instantly. To the prota's surprise, the bunny's horn begins to emit an intense, magical glow right after the healing process finishes. The glow of the horn soon fades away, leaving Ju-won intrigued as he remembers that the experienced Gus had never mentioned anything about that before. The prota recalls that during archery practice the previous day, he decided to ask Gus about the rabbits that possess horns. He remembers Gus explaining that that type of creature is an extremely dangerous wild magical beast that usually inhabits the forests. However, the hunter mentioned that they can be gentle if raised from infancy, and that many people in the world tend to adopt them as pets. However, since Gus didn't say anything about the horn glowing, Ju-won wonders thoughtfully if there are different species of that animal around there. He approaches the small rabbit with a tense smile and softly questions the reason for the glow, hoping it isn't dangerous. The little creature lets out a high-pitched squeak, leaving the prota quite confused, wondering if rabbits usually make that kind of sound. Ju-won tries to talk to the animal, asking if it can understand him, but the bunny just repeats the same high-pitched sound back. Concluding that the animal doesn't understand him, he decides to ask Gus later until he is interrupted by Dorothy asking him to name the pets. Dorothy points enthusiastically and asks for really pretty names, just like hers, leaving her dad thinking about what to pick. He thinks carefully about the choice of names and realizes that if his daughter is named Dorothy, there is a classic, ideal combination he should use with a smile on his face. The prota points to the small, real horned bunny and announces that its name from now on will be Oz Next. He points to the cute plush toy and decides to name it Toto, making Dorothy let out a squeal of excitement. Holding the basket joyfully, the girl excitedly repeats the three names together, celebrating the formation of her new little group of friends. She begins running in circles around the cabin yard, shouting the pets' names out loud while celebrating with immense joy. Lizzie watches her daughter's contagious happiness and lets out a gentle laugh, while Dorothy keeps running and having fun in the yard. Meanwhile, in the neighboring village, an atmosphere of panic begins to spread with rumors that the terrible goblins might attack the homes there. The villagers comment on seeking help in the city and fearfully recall terrible stories of how these creatures kill all the men. One of the men, extremely terrified and breaking into a cold sweat, suggests that everyone flee immediately, being far too scared to stay in the village. Further ahead, a man asks a female resident if she has finished cleaning the public carriage, leaving the woman quite annoyed by the order. She complains about having to do all the cleaning work alone, but he fires back, saying they'll need the carriage ready in case they have to flee. The chief's wife complains, saying she thought there were few goblins, and questions why they don't use their own cart, but he calls her an idiot for suggesting that she tells him to stop complaining and sneak some food into the carriage when no one is looking, and the man ends up accepting the order. He walks away grumbling indignantly, wondering why absolutely nothing in his life seems to go according to plan. The village chief bitterly recalls that things didn't go well during his meeting with the information broker last time either. He remembers that the broker only wanted to know about the strength of the village mages, grumbling about how rare it is to find a healing mage filled with anger. The village chief kicks a small stone on the street and curses, stating that absolutely nothing is working out for him. Hidden in the woods, Gus watches attentively and reflects that although goblins are violent and fight frequently, the situation there is worse. He notes the extreme tension that is formed among the creatures as he watches a violent fight break out among them. The hunter realizes a full-blown rebellion has erupted in the pack. As the beast's hunger and suppressed desires have finally exploded, he knows the exiled rebels will head straight for the village after women, but worries that it is still too early for that to happen. If they attack before the adventurers arrive, his plan will be ruined, making him think about using an emergency item to divert them. Gus tries to think of a suitable location to lure the monsters to and ends up spotting Juhuan's isolated cabin in the middle of the forest. With a cold and cruel glare, he satisfies himself, concluding that that isolated mountain cabin would be the perfect target for his trap. Gus remembers how Dorothy used to be a sad child who never smiled and always hid in the house whenever strangers showed up. He feels a slight pang of regret, knowing she only learned to smile after meeting Juhuan, but thinks it's far too late to feel any guilt. He coldly concludes that, being outsiders with no ties to the village, Juhuan's wife and daughter were already destined for sacrifice. Gus remembers the words of his late father, who said he had raised him to be a perfect hunter from a very young age. His father warned him that he was perfect as a hunter, but lacked humanity, which would make his entire life utterly miserable. The man sorrowfully apologized to his son for giving him such a harsh upbringing, completely void of affection and compassion. In the present, Gus rejects his late father's thoughts and proudly whispers that his cold life as a hunter is absolutely perfect. He reveals there is something he wants to achieve, even if it costs his own life. Because feeling that extreme rush is his definition of happiness, Gus thinks proudly that he now has an incredibly strong disciple who will inherit all of his legendary mountain hunting skills. He believes his teachings will act as a grand seed, and that through Juhuan's pain, they will forge the most perfect hunter of all. Looking at the monsters moving through the woods, Gus confirms that, as expected, they are already heading straight toward the neighboring village. He reaches inside his green cloak and pulls out a small roll of sealed parchment that was kept very securely. With a nasty smile on his face, Gus prepares to use the emergency artifact and set his terrible trap in motion a little further along in the forest. A brown rabbit tries to break free from a rope securely tied to a tree branch. Juhuan appears right behind the animal in position and begins readying his hunting bow to take another accurate practice shot. As he uses his sharp knife on the game, he notices he doesn't hesitate like before, and that all his old aversion to it has finally disappeared. Juhuan walks back home holding the rabbit, thinking he is adapting very well to his new reality without even realizing it. Suddenly, the Proto freezes mid-step upon noticing something that catches his attention in the woods. He looks back over his shoulder and realizes there is a specific region of that forest where he has never been before. Since he still has some free time before needing to head home, he decides it's worth taking a look and exploring the area. Juhuan plans to take a different route that day to set up a few hunting traps in that new area of the mountain. If you're enjoying the manhwa and want the next part, like and comment.